Chapter 544. You go back first, Aisha said to Dean behind her without looking back. Dean didn't wait for her to say anything. He had already run far away. You are Aisha? Parna looked at Aisha and narrowed his eyes. Aisha looked down at him indifferently and said, Are these your last words? Parna raised his eyebrows and sneered, saying, Rumor has it that the holy maiden of the dragon clan is the most talented person in the past 100 years. Now it seems that she is just SOSO. If it was the holy son of your winged clan who said this, he would be qualified. Aisha was not angry and said indifferently, As for you, the third young master who couldn't even be elected as the holy son, aren't you ashamed to say this? Parna's face turned slightly red and he clenched his fists. When he was about to speak, he suddenly thought of something. His face changed slightly and he stared at Aisha fiercely. You want to delay me and wait for support? You were lucky this time. If we meet in the depths of the wasteland in the future, I will definitely pay you back. When he said the last word, his figure had turned into a shadow. Like an arrow leaving the bow, he quickly retreated down the mountain. His speed was several times faster than when he was chasing Dean. Obviously, he didn't chase with all his strength and reserved his physical strength. Otherwise, he would have caught Dean before he entered the mountain. Aisha snorted coldly. Her figure flashed and flew out from the blood-red sword. Like a slender and dexterous shadow, she swept in a straight line through the dense forest. But if you looked closely, you would find that every time she passed a big tree blocking her way, her figure would instantly move sideways, moving forward in a wavy line. However, because the curve around the tree was too fast, it looked like a straight line, chasing Parna in front of her. In the blink of an eye, Aisha's figure had caught up with Parna. As if knowing his intention, she didn't show any mercy and suddenly raised her hand. Parna's face was cold, and he didn't show any fear as he counterattacked. Bang! Parna's eyes showed a trace of astonishment. His body rushed backward uncontrollably. He quickly unloaded the force, but he still broke 2 or 3 big trees before stopping. He only felt that his palm was numb and had lost feeling. His wrist was in extreme pain, and the bones inside seemed to be shattered. How is this possible? Parna climbed up from the ground. He was shocked. Through thermal vision, he saw that Aisha's body heat wasn't much higher than his. Even when she was chasing, she didn't reveal too much heat. Even people who could hide their body heat would find it difficult to hide their body heat in battle. After all, once the body exerted strength, the camouflage would easily fail. However, with this physique that was only slightly higher than his own, the surging force coming from the latter's palm was shockingly strong. If it wasn't for his quick reaction, his palm would have broken on the spot. After Aisha struck with her palm, her body was slightly buffered, and she quickly chased after him again. Parna looked at her quickly approaching figure, and a trace of fear flashed in his eyes. He hurriedly turned around and ran. Whoosh! His body flew through the forest. Because he had been here once before, he had already memorized the general terrain. At this moment, as he fled, he specifically chose the densest part of the forest to run towards. Aisha's speed had to be slightly reduced due to the obstruction of the trees. In the blink of an eye, the two had chased to the foot of the mountain. Although the distance was far, the whole process only took about 10 seconds. Whoosh! As soon as he got out of the forest, the wings behind Parna couldn't wait to spread out. He hurriedly jumped, and his speed soared under the flapping of his wings, quickly distancing himself from Aisha. Parna turned his head and saw Aisha, who had just drilled out of the dense forest, looking up at him. She seemed to have given up the chase. What a monster! Parna breathed a sigh of relief and secretly said in his heart. Suddenly, a murderous intent locked on his back. The dense murderous intent was like a sharp sword, making his whole body's hair stand up. Not good. Just as these 2 words flashed through his mind, before he could react, a piercing pain suddenly came from his left wing with a puff. He looked at it in horror and suddenly saw a black dagger nailed to the place where the wing connected to the back instead of the wing membrane. Otherwise, the dagger would have directly pierced through. His body shook and almost fell down. He was so scared that he hurriedly endured the pain and stabilized his body. At the same time, he tightly locked his attention on the slender figure on the ground behind him. He didn't dare to be careless. Gradually, he flew further and further away until he could no longer see that figure. Only then did he heave a sigh of relief. Dirty rat. Aisha glanced at him from afar. A trace of coldness flashed in her eyes, but she didn't continue to chase. Although with her real strength, she could easily catch up with this person and kill him, this would expose her third awakening. The rest of the exploration team was not far away. The battle here had probably attracted their attention, and they were rushing here. She withdrew her gaze and turned back to the dense forest. Soon, she saw her closest companion, the blood-baron sword. Next to the sword stood a figure. It was Dean, who had previously run far away. Dean had already seen the Wing family youth flying away from the sky. Although he felt that it was a pity that Aisha didn't kill him, at least his life was saved. It had to be said that there were a lot of bad luck, but occasionally there would be a little good luck. You saved me again. Dean smiled bitterly. Aisha grinned and said, Every time I appear, you seem to be in danger. Dean was a little embarrassed and said, Fortunately, every time you appear, it's very timely. You're lucky. Aisha smiled gently. She stepped forward and grabbed the blood-baron sword. She pulled it out and put it back on her back. The bandage on her back was like a magnet that took the initiative to wrap around the sword. She glanced at Dean and saw that he was covered with mud, including his hair and ears. He looked very embarrassed. She said, Have you been hiding from him? Dean replied, I just hid for a while. It's very good to be able to deal with him for a while. Aisha whispered, This person is the second candidate of the Wing family. His strength is not comparable to ordinary pioneers, especially in terms of perception. The second candidate of the Holy Sun? Dean was surprised. He didn't expect this Wing family youth to have such a big background. Wasn't his identity equivalent to Hathaway's? You're here to perform a mission, right? What about your teammates? Were they all killed by him? Aisha asked. Dean recalled what happened today, especially the intrigue with Ian and the others when he was fleeing. He couldn't help but sigh and said, They should all be dead. Chapter 545. Aisha glanced at Dean and said, Did you meet something when you were on the mission? Dean's heart moved when he heard her sudden question, and he truthfully said, Our mission was to kill a rare monster called Silencer. But after we found the nest of the Silencer, we saw a legendary monster called Shadow Hunter. But it was already dead. We didn't know what killed it. We didn't have time to collect its parasitic soul worm when this person appeared. Dead? Aisha was startled for a moment, and her brows slightly wrinkled. She pondered for a moment and said to Dean, Where is its body? Take me to see it. Okay. Dean nodded. Seeing that she wasn't surprised when she heard Shadow Hunter, he knew that his guess was right. She already knew that there was a Shadow Hunter here. The reason why she asked him was mostly because she thought that the Wing family youth had worked hard to sneak in, so he didn't want to kill the Dragon Guards. Instead, he had other purposes, so he didn't hide it and chose to tell the truth. Whoosh, whoosh. Dean led the way. Along the way, he saw the bodies of Rosemary and Ruby. Both of them died tragically. Their heads were separated from their bodies, and their bodies fell on the roadside weeds in this wilderness. Some unknown earthworm-like crimson worms were crawling on the severed heads, gnawing on the fresh and delicious brain and blood inside. Both of them had just died, but their bodies became a feast for the strange worms in the wilderness. Dean's face changed slightly. Although his heart was as hard as stone, he suddenly felt the fragility and poverty of life. He had been eating, drinking, and fighting these days. In the blink of an eye, the corpses of these weak, strange insects were exposed to the wilderness and became nourishment for these weak, strange insects. Are they your teammates? Aisha followed Dean and said, Do you want to bring their bodies back? Now you're the only one left in your team. If you bring their bodies, your return journey will be more dangerous. Of course, Dean didn't plan to bring their bodies. Not to mention that he had no feelings for these people. Even if Sergei, Nicotine, and others were here, he wouldn't take the risk to collect their bodies in this situation. From his point of view, the meaning of life was to live. If one was already dead, then life was equivalent to the end, leaving behind only an insignificant shell. Risking his life for such a body was a stupid thing that he would never do. However, this idea was a bit cold-blooded after all. He didn't want to expose it to Haisha. He thought for a moment and said, "Let's cremate them here. Let their souls accompany their ashes to watch over this land where they fought and fought for eternity." Aisha also had the same idea. Dean's words made her feel the same way. She nodded and said, "All right, then cremate them." Dean immediately picked up some withered branches nearby and piled the two bodies together. When he picked up Rosemary's head, the earthworm-like worms that crawled in her head wriggled towards his fingers. Dean felt a trace of nausea and didn't want to touch this strange worm. He picked up a clump of her hair and threw her head on her body. The girl's face was still full of horror. Dean took out a match and ignited the dead branch. After a while, the fire burned, igniting the bodies of Ruby and Rosemary, including the armor on their bodies. Under the roasting of the flames, the earthworm-like worms on their heads let out squeaks and writhed in pain. Some fell off and fell into the flames and were quickly burned to death. Some desperately drilled into the bodies of the dead. Dean watched for a while and knew that it wouldn't be finished in a while. So he said to Aisha, "Let's go." Aisha nodded slightly. The two returned to the previous Shadowhunter's nest. Dean vigilantly scanned the surroundings, but he didn't see any other abnormalities. He was a little relieved and said to Haisha, "The Shadowhunter is in this cave." At the same time, he looked at the cave entrance, and he was stunned. If he remembered correctly, Ian's body seemed to be here, but there was nothing on the ground. What happened? He was puzzled. Suddenly, he thought of the underground nest in the depths of the cave, and he couldn't help but feel a chill. Could it be that the newly hatched shadow hunter inside dragged Ian's body away? Whoosh! At this time, Aisha's figure flashed and appeared in front of the cave like teleportation. She looked inside and suddenly saw the shadow hunter's body lying on the ground. A glimmer of light flashed in her eyes. When she came in front of the huge body, she suddenly saw the eye-catching wound on the body. There were no other wounds near the wound. It seemed to be a fatal blow. Her face changed slightly. She jumped to the shadow hunter's body, stretched out her hand, and gently touched the edge of the wound. Her white fingertips were stained with some thick mucus. She brought it to the tip of her nose and sniffed it. Her pupils shrank. Dean entered the cave and saw Aisha's action. He asked, "Do you know what killed this thing? Isn't the legendary monster the strongest monster? How could it be killed so quickly? Could it be that there are more powerful monsters above this legendary monster?" Aisha jumped down from the shadow hunter's body, and her face became a little gloomy. She said, "Of course there is. In the depths of the wasteland, there are all kinds of monsters. There are even monsters that can destroy the giant wall. If I'm not wrong, the one who killed this shadow hunter should be a legendary hunter." Legendary hunter? Dean was stunned. It was the first time he heard this name, but from the literal meaning, it was quite frightening. This is a kind of monster in the wasteland. Just like its name, it likes to hunt and kill legendary monsters and other named monsters. It's very fierce. Aisha narrowed her eyes slightly and said, "Even legendary monsters can't escape death when encountering this thing. It's hard for us pioneers to survive if we encounter it." Dean was startled. Although he knew that there was always someone better than him, he didn't expect that a super monster like the legendary monster was not the pinnacle of this world. There was actually a terrifying monster like the legendary hunter above it. Chapter 546. Seeing that she was about to leave, Dean's heart jumped, and he hurriedly said, "Are you going to look for it? Didn't you say that even if you pioneers encountered it, it would be difficult to escape death? I'm talking about ordinary pioneers without bloodline power." Aisha's eyes swept over Dean's shoulder and looked at the dark cave behind him. She said, "This cave should have been dug by the shadow hunter. Most likely there are eggs inside. The shadow hunter will only build a cave when it's ready to ovulate. If you have time, you can go inside and check. If there are really shadow hunter eggs, remember to move them out and find a place to hide them separately. In this way, they can play the greatest value. Hide them separately? Dean was puzzled. Yes, Aisha said. The shadow hunter is different from other monsters. From the beginning of its birth, its first target is the companions that hatched with it. This is also the survival philosophy of the shadow hunter. Dean was stunned. You mean, the shadow hunter that hatches first will kill the companions that hatch later? Aisha nodded and said, in this wasteland, you can encounter danger at any time. Even legendary monsters are very weak when they're just hatched and can easily become the prey of other monsters. Therefore, after the shadow hunter hatches, it will often lurk in the nest opened by its mother, waiting for its new brothers to hatch. Then it will hunt and eat them, so that it can enter the mature period as soon as possible. This process usually takes about 15 days. In other words, it only takes 15 days for the second mature shadow hunter to appear. Dean was startled. From hatching to maturity, it only takes a short 15 days? He felt that was a bit unbelievable. It took at least 2 months for the splitter to enter the growth period, and this was still under the condition that there was sufficient food supply. And from the growth period to the mature period, it took even longer. But this shadow hunter only needed half a month to turn a newborn shadow hunter into a terrifying monster with a hunting level of more than 60. Doesn't the big shadow hunter care about it? They are all its children. How can it watch them kill each other? Dean couldn't help but ask. Aisha smiled and said, of course it doesn't care. Monsters are monsters, and we humans are humans. For us, it's not desirable to kill each other, but in their thinking, there's no such concept. The only thing they have is survival. Dean was startled and suddenly understood. He sighed and said, so, whoever is born first will be the survivor that eats all the remaining eggs. Aisha shook her head slightly and said, not necessarily the first. Every newly hatched shadow hunter has a layer of amniotic membrane on its body. This layer of amniotic membrane will protect it from the attacks of its companions. When it really enters the juvenile stage, this layer of amniotic membrane will be shed. At that time, it will be a real fight. In each nest of eggs, only one will survive, and this one will follow the mother and establish its own tribe and territory until the next time it reproduces. Dean nodded slightly and sighed with emotion in his heart. Fortunately, he knew this news. Otherwise, this nest of shadow hunters' eggs would have been wasted and suffered heavy losses. I'll go first. Be careful, Aisha said and was ready to leave. Dean quickly said, are you sure you can deal with it? Seeing the worried look on his face, Aisha slightly pursed her mouth, revealing a smile, and said, it's hard to say. But even if I can't beat it, at least protecting myself is not a problem. Then, she took a step forward and quickly disappeared into the woods outside the cave. Dean looked at her back, gradually disappearing. He retracted his gaze and turned to look at the dark depths of the cave. Thinking of the shadow hunter hiding in the shadows, a trace of coldness emerged in his heart. He caught a glimpse of Martin's sword on the ground and immediately bent down to pick it up. Then he glanced at Martin's body at the edge of the cave, and a trace of doubt flashed in his eyes. That shadow hunter only took Ian's body, but didn't take Martin's body. Could it be that it couldn't take 2 bodies at once? If this was the case, didn't it mean that it had just taken Ian's body and would soon return? Thinking of this, Dean's heart shivered. He picked up Martin's sword, then took off his gloves and put them on his own hand. He glanced at Martin's body, and his eyes flashed for a moment. Finally, he stretched out his hand, lifted Martin's severed head, and entered the cave. After a while, Dean quietly sneaked to the top of the underground nest. He quietly peeked into the hole, but he didn't see the shadow hunter. He breathed a sigh of relief and threw Martin's head down. There was a thud, and Martin's head landed on the sticky floor inside. It rolled twice. The surroundings were quiet. In a blink of an eye, more than 10 minutes passed. Suddenly, a shadow flashed by, and Martin's head, which fell right below the cave, was lifted up and plunged into the depths of the nest. Dean's eyes flashed, and he suddenly jumped down. His eyes immediately locked on the shadow. It was the shadow hunter that killed Luna. Its body quickly climbed up the nest's rock wall like a lizard, and the next moment, it disappeared on the rock wall, as if it was integrated into the rock wall. Dean was stunned. He carefully stared at it, but he still couldn't see anything strange. This thing actually disappeared from his sight. He slowly walked toward the rock wall with the sword in his hand. Suddenly, he saw a bit of sticky water slowly seeping out of the rock wall. He couldn't help but be startled. Looking at the traces of the water, he saw the water slowly went up along the rock wall until it reached the top of the rock wall. Dean was startled. Suddenly, his heart moved. He tiptoed and picked up a stone from the ground. His eyes were fixed on the rock wall. He grabbed the stone and threw it. Bang! The stone hit the rock wall and instantly shattered. Dean immediately noticed that there were traces of slippage from the top of the rock wall, along with the traces of damp swamp. Seeing this scene, he immediately knew that his guess was right. This shadow hunter seemed to have the ability to change colors. It could blend in with the surrounding environment. Finding a way to identify it, Dean's heart was determined. He didn't stay any longer and suddenly jumped up. When he was near the top of the rock wall, he suddenly slashed the sword toward the top of the traces of wet water. Hiss! Chapter 547. After seeing through the shadow hunter's hiding method, Dean immediately took advantage of the victory to pursue. Whoosh! He stepped on a rock wall and rushed forward. His fingernails grew by a few inches, and he quickly grabbed the shadow hunter's tail. Seeing that hiding had failed, the shadow hunter roared angrily, and its hideous triangular head turned to lick Dean's outstretched palm. Its tongue was extremely long, forked like a lizard, with dark purple spots and rivet-like sharp teeth on the tongue. Dean snorted and suddenly waved his sword like a silver fan, leaving an afterimage. Bang! The sword slashed on the rock wall, cutting off the tongue that the shadow hunter had retracted in time. Blood gushed out from the severed tongue, splashing on the rock wall and the sword. There was a hissing sound of corrosion. The rare alloy sword that Martin had specially exchanged for showed slight signs of corrosion. Dean was shocked. The blood of this monster is corrosive? No, the big shadow hunter above the cave bled more, but it didn't corrode anything. He glanced at the rock wall from the corner of his eyes. He saw the traces of blood on the rock wall, but it wasn't corroded. He immediately understood that the blood of this monster should be allergic to metal and could corrode metal. Thinking of this, he didn't flinch and continued to chase quickly with his sword. The shadow hunter's tongue was injured, so it screeched angrily like a baby crying. It turned around and quickly ran up the rock wall like a crawling gecko. Its movements were agile, and it firmly attached to the rock wall. The scales on its body changed color and turned into the appearance of a rock, which was exactly the same as the rock where it was. Even the texture was the same. It was a perfect fit without any flaws. Even if the eyes were locked on the shadow hunter, it was easy to be confused by this strange invisibility ability. Dean fell from the rock wall and jumped up again. After a few steps, he stepped on the rock wall and rushed toward a depression in the rock crack. His sword suddenly slashed out. Whoosh! The depression in the rock wall moved quickly, revealing the figure of the shadow hunter. It ran forward like it was running for its life. Dean slashed on the rock wall, and his feet suddenly twisted. At the same time, the sword slashed on the rock wall, driving his body to turn sideways and slashed upward again. Puff! The sword slashed on the shadow hunter's tail and immediately cut it off. A lot of blood sprayed from the broken tail, splashing on the sword and the standard armor on Dean's body. He reached out to protect his face in case the blood was poisonous. Hiss! Faint smoke rose from the sword due to the corrosion, but there were only some pits on Dean's armor, and it was not penetrated by the corrosion. Dean breathed a sigh of relief when he saw that his expectation was right. This armor was not entirely made of metal, but a mixture of special rubber materials. It was flexible, resistant to radiation, and had a high defense, which was just enough to resist the shadow hunter's blood. Whoosh! His body lost its leverage and fell down. The shadow hunter was stimulated by the severe pain after its tail was cut off. It quickly ran up and disappeared in the blink of an eye. Dean had already tested the strength of this shadow hunter. In addition to its unique lurking ability, which was more terrifying, its frontal combat ability was relatively average. It was similar to a level 40 monster. He didn't want to delay any longer. He stimulated the wings on his back, stomped on the ground, and rushed toward a rock wall. When the rock wall saw Dean rushing over, it quickly returned to the appearance of the shadow hunter and fled to other places. It screamed in horror and despair. Its best ability was ineffective in front of Dean, and its disguise was seen through several times, making it feel like it was suddenly exposed to the sun from the darkness. There was an indescribable fear and awkwardness. Dean's feet touched the rock wall, turned around, and suddenly rushed out. Seeing that it couldn't escape, the shadow hunter screamed in horror and turned to rush toward Dean. Whoosh! A liquid suddenly shot out from its screaming mouth. The speed was extremely fast. Dean's pupils shrank. He spun his wings and stamped his feet on the rock wall. His body suddenly made a 90-degree turn, narrowly avoiding the unknown liquid. He didn't dare to be careless. He quickly approached the shadow hunter, and his sword went straight to its head. The shadow hunter twisted its head, stretched out two plier-like limbs from under its body, and clamped the combat knife. The sword suddenly turned and slashed toward its abdomen. Puff! A scratch appeared on the scales on its abdomen, but it didn't cut its body. Dean was startled. Suddenly, his pupils shrank slightly. He saw that the edge of the sword was a bit blunt. Was it corroded by the previous blood? Dean's face changed slightly. The shadow hunter's abdomen was injured. Although there was no blood, the huge force of the sword made it feel pain. It screamed and crazily rushed toward Dean. Its broken tail swung and wrapped around one of Dean's legs. Its body circled around and rushed toward Dean's chest. Dean reacted. His body slightly swayed, and he raised his leg to avoid the tail. A glimmer of light suddenly flashed in his eyes. At the moment when the shadow hunter rushed toward him, he took a big step forward. His body was half squatting, and he quickly hit the shadow hunter's chest. Puff! Blood suddenly sprayed out. The sword in his hand had pierced into the shadow hunter's abdomen, piercing through its body. Squeak! The shadow hunter screamed loudly, and its body suddenly twisted crazily. Dean hurriedly let go and quickly retreated. The shadow hunter crawled a few steps and wanted to chase, but the blade on its abdomen rubbed against the rock wall, making the wound bigger. It had to stop, look down at its abdomen, and then looked up at Dean. It opened its mouth and made a baby-like cry, like a wail, but also like a cry for help. Dean frowned slightly. He flapped his wings and floated in the air, waiting for the shadow hunter's blood to flow out. The shadow hunter slowly climbed from the rock wall to the ground. Its body stood upright, and a few claws on its abdomen gently touched the sword. It seemed to want to pull the sword out, but it didn't know how. After repeated touching, it seemed to gradually learn. Its two claws suddenly closed, squeezed the handle of the sword, and suddenly pushed forward. Puff! The sword was pulled out, and blood sprayed out, but quickly stopped. After the sword was thrown out, it fell to the ground. The body of the sword had been seriously corroded and full of holes. Dean's face was gloomy. He didn't expect the shadow hunter to be so tenacious. It could still stand up after suffering such a fatal wound, and it seemed to be slowly healing. He no longer waited, pulled out the dagger at his leg, and suddenly swooped down. The shadow hunter looked up at Dean, and suddenly bared its teeth and roared. It opened its mouth and spat out a few streams of liquid. At the same time, its tongue sprang out like a spring, directly hitting Dean's face. Dean's expression was indifferent. His body suddenly turned in the air and disappeared in front of the shadow hunter. The shadow hunter's ejected tongue didn't hit Dean, and seeing the target disappear, it was stunned for a moment. The next moment, it suddenly turned its head. Just as it was about to react, its body suddenly stiffened and trembled slightly. Chapter 548. A cold light flashed in Dean's eyes, and he twisted his palm. Crack! The shadow hunter's carapace made a cracking sound, seeming to loosen up. At the same time, green blood splashed out from the inside, splashing on his hand. The gloves on his hand were corroded, and there was a burning pain, as if a few sparks had fallen on his hand. He quickly retracted his hand and shook off the blood on the gloves. At the same time, he kicked the Shadow Hunter's back, kicking the Shadow Hunter's body forward. Without waiting for the Shadow Hunter to get up, Dean quickly followed up with a kick. He raised his leg high and suddenly smashed down like a black giant axe. The heel wrapped in the alloy boots hit the dagger hilt on the wound. Puff! The dagger was completely inserted into the Shadow Hunter's neck, and the Shadow Hunter's body hit the ground, making a loud noise. The Shadow Hunter screamed and struggled, trying to crawl away. Dean saw that it was so tough, and his eyes flashed coldly. He turned over and smashed down again. Bang! The Shadow Hunter's head was completely trampled into the ground, creating a football-sized hole. The Shadow Hunter's head twisted slightly, pulling a few centimeters away from its neck. Its body trembled slightly, and its tail twisted and wound around Dean's foot, coiling like a viper. It tightened slightly, trying to strangle Dean. Dean felt that the strength of the entanglement was not strong, and he was relieved. He knew that the Shadow Hunter wouldn't be able to live for long. He immediately stepped on the Shadow Hunter's back with one foot and lifted the other, breaking free from the entanglement of the tail. Then he flapped his wings and rose to the top of the rock wall. He suddenly turned over and stepped on the top of the wall, diving down. At the moment when he was close to the Shadow Hunter, his body turned 180 degrees and one foot was shaved off. Bang! The sole of the foot was shaved on the Shadow Hunter's back, and the sound of bones breaking came. The Shadow Hunter's head and lower body were slightly raised up, and it screamed and fell down again. Its body was still twitching and shivering, but it didn't try to get up again. Dean saw that it was dying, so he immediately jumped to the side and glanced at the gloves. The blood on the gloves was slowly corroding, especially the metal bar on the back of the gloves, which had been corroded. He sighed, took off the gloves, and threw them away. He thought that this Shadow Hunter should be the most troublesome monster. The battle was not over yet, but its weapons and armor were destroyed. If its vitality was more tenacious, almost no one would dare to provoke it. I don't know if the small one was hidden or eaten by it. Dean paid close attention to the surroundings, quietly waiting, and at the same time recovering his physical strength. Previously, he was chased by the Wing family youth and fought with this Shadow Hunter. Most of his physical strength had been consumed. Dean suddenly noticed a bag on the ground not far away. It was the place where Eugene's body was. Eugene's body was gone at the moment. The bag was Eugene's luggage. Was the body eaten by this thing? Dean's eyes moved. He picked up the bag and untied it. Inside were some stored grains and highly purified water, in addition to ropes, hooks, fire sickles, foldable bags, and other survival items. In addition to these things, he also saw a few empty bottles for storing parasitic soulworms, but one of the bottles had something in it. Dean's eyes brightened. He took it out and saw a small parasitic soulworm in the bottle. It was the one taken from the cytoplasmic hunter that Eugene had killed. Almost missed you. Dean raised the bottle and looked at it, revealing a smile on his face. The parasitic soulworm in the bottle seemed to notice Dean. It suddenly stretched out from its curled state and wriggled against the bottle. Its soft feet gently patted the bottle as if it wanted to come out. Dean chuckled. When the matter here is settled, I'll free you. Then he put away the bottle and took out the stored grains and purified water to eat and drink to restore his physical strength. While eating, he always paid attention to the surroundings to guard against another ambush. After he finished eating, the body of the Shadow Hunter on the ground had stopped trembling and was completely stiff. Dean wiped Martin's sword clean with the bag wrapped in the grains. He held the handle and poked the wound on the body. Seeing that there was still no reaction, he was a little relieved. He used the sword that had been corroded and blunt and inserted it along the wound on the neck, prying the wound bigger until the whole head was pried off the body. After the head was separated, Dean looked at the blood flowing all over the ground. He squatted down and gently fiddled with the sword, looking for the parasitic soulworm in the body. With the strength of this Shadow Hunter, it should have reached the growth stage. I hope there are parasitic soulworms in its body. Dean was looking forward to it and was nervous. He carefully searched, and at the same time, he paid most of his attention to the surroundings. After more than 10 minutes, Dean searched all the blood and body, but he didn't see the shadow of the parasitic soul worm. His heart became more and more disappointed. Just as he was about to give up, he suddenly saw a strange blood vessel in the tender flesh of the shadow hunter's head. It was slightly thicker than the other blood vessels around it, like an S shape hovering on the tender flesh of the head. Dean was startled. He carefully picked it up with the tip of the sword and immediately found that it was a parasitic soul worm. However, the parasitic soul worm was motionless, as if it was dead. Dean wanted to get closer to take a closer look, but he was suddenly worried that it would suddenly come alive and jump into his eyes. He immediately observed it from a distance. After looking for a while, he couldn't see anything. Dean thought for a moment, put on a bottle cap, and gently poked it with the tip of the sword, pressing its body to the point that it was almost cut. The parasitic soul worm still had no reaction, as if it was already dead. Dean frowned and suddenly thought of some things he heard from Ian and others when he lived with them these days. Is it a parasite egg? Parasite eggs were equivalent to the young eggs of parasitic soul worms. When the name monster entered the growth stage, the eggs would hatch and grow into parasitic soul worms. The one in front of him was more in line with the parasite egg that Ian and others had told him. Before the parasite egg hatched, the host would be killed, and the parasite egg would enter a state of stopping breeding. Other non-named monsters could be used as a host to provide nutrients and continue to hatch. Chapter 549. Reincarnated beasts usually evolve from non-named monsters. If an unhatched parasite egg was placed on another named monster, it would instead be devoured by the parasitic soul worm of the named monster itself, turning it into the most primitive of nutrients. It would not retain any of its abilities. Dean looked at the parasite egg, his eyes flashing slightly. Although it was an unhatched parasite egg, it was, after all, a legendary monster's parasitic soul worm. Its value was still amazing. If exchanged in the market, it was worth more than 10 rare parasitic soul worms. However, for Dean, this thing made him a little confused. If he wanted to hatch it, he needed to choose a suitable new host and raise it carefully. It would take at least a few months for the parasite egg to hatch in the new host, during which he must take good care of it. This kind of thing was not a problem for a big family like the dragon family. They had a lot of manpower and could assign special personnel to take care of it. But Dean could only fight alone. If he let Sergei take care of it, it was tantamount to seducing people to commit a crime. After all, it was the legendary parasitic soul worm. Once the other side was tempted, they would not only take the parasite away, but also take the initiative to frame him for fear of revenge. After experiencing so many things, Dean had a deeper understanding of people's hearts. The so-called loyalty was just a process of fighting with desire. Once the fight failed, it was betrayal. Legendary parasitic soul worm. I don't know if it is too extravagant to use it as nourishment. Dean muttered to himself with a different kind of emotion. Perhaps because he was a deified legendary magic mark, he didn't look at the legendary magic mark as excited and envious as before. But he knew that if this thing was left in the giant wall, it would most likely cause countless high-level people to fight for it. If it was used as nourishment for the magic mark, it would be a reckless waste of natural resources. It was equivalent to using gold to cast bricks to build a house. He struggled for a while, but finally shook his head and resisted the temptation in his heart. Although he could bring it back to the giant wall to sell, or keep it for his trusted confidants to maximize the value of this thing in the future, but right now, survival was a problem, and he might die in the next moment. It was too far away to think about it. After making up his mind, Dean no longer thought about it. He sealed the parasite egg in a bottle and prepared to find a safe place to absorb it. After doing this, he looked around and gave up the idea of looking for another shadow hunter that might be alive. He walked to an egg, picked it up, and sent it to the cave above. After putting it down, he returned to the nest and immediately saw that there was an oval-shaped pit under the eggs that had been moved away. Dean frowned and glanced at the nest. A total of 37 eggs. After counting the number of eggs, he pondered. It was impossible to report all of these shadow hunter eggs to the dragon clan. After all, they were the eggs of legendary monsters. Although it was a problem whether they could hatch out of the nest environment. If they were lucky enough to hatch one or two, it was equivalent to having one or two legendary magic marks. Such a temptation was worth the risk. It doesn't matter if I hide it or not. The dragon clan will suspect me. If I don't hide it, they will think that I am hiding it. Dean said to himself. In other words, it doesn't matter if I hide or not. The important thing is not to touch their bottom line. Thinking of this, he suddenly had an estimate. He bent down and continued to pick up the eggs, sending them to the cave above. After carrying 8 eggs in a row, Dean stopped and returned to the nest. He smoothed the egg pit on the ground and smeared the sticky liquid on the ground on top of the egg pit, making it look the same as the surroundings. After disguising the scene, Dean glanced at the corpse of the shadow hunter. After thinking for a moment, he didn't take it away. If he left it here, it might give the dragon clan a feeling that there was a fight here. In that case, even if they noticed that the eggs might be missing, he would have one more reason to clear his name. Whoosh! He flew up the hole and came to the cave outside. Looking at the 8 white eggs on the ground, he clamped them under his armpit. Carrying 4 at the same time was already his limit, so he could only carry them twice. I have to find a secret place to hide them. I don't know when these things will hatch. If they hatch when I leave, my efforts will be in vain. Dean frowned slightly. This was very possible. Even if he immediately returned to the dragon clan and reported this matter, it would take 2 months before he could come to the wasteland for the second mission. If the second mission was in another wasteland, he could only find an opportunity to sneak here. Thinking of these problems, he felt it was a bit tricky. After thinking for a moment, he finally decided to find a more secure place to hide these eggs separately. He only hoped that after these shadow hunters hatched individually, their growth speed wouldn't be that fast. Whoosh! He flew out of the cave with 4 eggs. When he passed through the cave entrance, he saw Martin's corpse. His heart suddenly moved, and he immediately changed direction, flying toward the previous escape route. After a while, he came to the place where Ruby died and rummaged around in the weeds. Soon, he found Ruby's backpack under the cover of a few fallen leaves. He immediately opened it and saw that in addition to some mountaineering tools, there were several bottles and jars. Some were healing powders that could stop bleeding in time, and some were medicinal powders that could inhibit the spread of toxins. In addition, 3 of the bottles had 3 strange-looking worms. When the backpack was opened, the 3 worms in the bottles were stimulated by the light and slowly twisted. Dean was relieved when he finally found them. These 3 parasitic soul worms were corpse pecker, blood cinder, and wind listener's parasitic soul worms. Wind listener's parasitic soul worm is this time's mission item. I'll keep it for the time being. The other 2 can be eaten. Dean thought in his heart. He took out the bottles of the 3 parasitic soul worms and put them in his backpack along with the rest of the medicinal powders. Then he picked up 4 white eggs and flew high into the sky, looking for a suitable place to hide the shadow hunter's eggs. After flying at high altitude for about half an hour, Dean had almost explored more than half of the ruined city, but he still didn't find the desired hiding place. The city was too dilapidated. Although the basement under the building was hidden, the dragon guards who came out to perform missions liked to choose such a basement to live at night to avoid monsters. Moreover, the concrete above the basement was already on the verge of collapse and couldn't lock the hatched shadow hunter's eggs. Dean frowned and searched around. Suddenly, at the end of his field of vision, he saw a figure staggering on a desolate and broken street. It was Aisha, who had just left not long ago. At this moment, her hair was a bit messy, and her exquisite armor was stained with a lot of dust and blood. It was somewhat damaged. Judging from her walking posture, it seemed that she was seriously injured and couldn't even walk normally. Chapter 550. Is she injured? Dean was shocked. Without any hesitation, he swooped down from the sky with 4 eggs and went straight to Aisha. Aisha gasped softly, holding the wall and walking along the street. She just wanted to leave as soon as possible and find a suitable place to hide. However, with every step she took, she felt a lot of physical strength was lost. Her whole body was so weak that it was difficult for her to breathe. There seemed to be a thought in her heart that kept persuading herself to lie down and rest like this. It would be much more comfortable that way. But she knew that if she fainted here, she would most likely become the food of passing monsters or undead. Whoosh! Suddenly, she heard the sound of the wind breaking above her head. She could not help but look up and suddenly saw a black shadow approaching rapidly. She was shocked. Just as she was about to fight, she suddenly saw the face of the black shadow. It was Dean. She was stunned. The next moment, Dean fell from the sky and landed in front of her. He took a few steps closer and said, "Are you okay?" Aisha saw Dean was full of concern. She was relieved and said weakly, "I'm fine." Dean looked at her weak voice and was secretly surprised. He did not expect that, with her strength, she would be in such a situation in the Orange Wasteland. He could not help but ask, "Have you found the legendary hunter?" "Yes." Aisha nodded gently and walked forward while holding the wall. Dean could not help but look up at the direction she came from. His face changed slightly. He did not expect the legendary hunter to be so strong that it was difficult for Aisha to resist. He could not help but ask, "Will it chase after us?" "No." Aisha reluctantly shook her head and said weakly, "It is dead." "Dead?" Dean was stunned. He stared at her and said, "You killed it?" Aisha whispered softly. Her feet suddenly became weak. Her body shook slightly, and she almost fell down. Dean looked at her clenching her teeth and quickly said, "You are so badly injured. Is there anything I can help you with?" "No need." Aisha shook her head slightly and took a deep breath. She slowly withdrew her hand from the wall and walked forward step by step. She seemed to have recovered a little, but her footsteps were extremely heavy. Her calves trembled slightly, as if she was trying to maintain balance. Dean didn't expect her to be so stubborn, but then he thought that maybe she did this because she didn't want to expose her weak side in front of him. Although they were acquaintances, but after all, they had been in contact with each other since childhood. Later they met twice, but the communication was not deep, so they were not very familiar with each other. At this moment, when she was at her weakest, even walking was difficult. She had no defense ability, so it was inevitable that she was vigilant. Thinking of this, he sighed inwardly. He pushed off the ground and flew away. There was a trace of loss in Aisha's eyes as she saw Dean fly away, but it quickly disappeared. She gritted her teeth and continued to move forward while holding the wall. Whoosh! Suddenly, another gust of wind descended. Aisha was startled. She looked up and saw Dean appear in front of her again. "I'll take you to a hidden place to let you heal." Without saying a word, Dean grabbed her wrist with one hand and held her body in his arms. His wings flapped, and his body soared into the sky, flying into the distance. Before leaving, he glanced at the street and remembered it. The 4 eggs he had taken out were hidden in a building on this street. He would come back to get them after Aisha was settled. Aisha was shocked when Dean held her wrist. Since she became a saint, she had never been touched so intimately by others, let alone by a man who had no blood relationship with her. She wanted to resist, but found that she couldn't lift the slightest strength. The next moment, she was carried by Dean and flew into the sky. She looked up at Dean. Seeing that he had no malice, she was a little relieved. She felt tired, and her vision was a little blurred. She saw that the gray radiation clouds seemed to be very close to her. Suddenly, an idea came to her mind. Will the clouds in heaven be black? Whoosh! Dean flew over more than a dozen streets and glided down from the sky. He stopped in front of a subway station. He saw that the road above the subway station had completely collapsed, exposing the subway platform inside. 2 subways were stopped on several tracks. One of them was submerged by the collapsed road, and the other subway was like a black snake dormant in the darkness, covered with moss and rust. On the ground outside the subway station, there were many bones, most of which were human skeletons. Dean looked at it. It was not difficult to imagine what kind of tragic massacre had happened here before the disaster. He jumped down from a broken subway window with Aisha in his arms. He saw that on the seats on both sides of the subway, There were skeletons and rotten corpses. Some of the corpses had light signs of decay. They were lying quietly with stone-gray skin, which was completely different from the surrounding skeletons. Obviously, these corpses were sleeping undeads. Dean's entry immediately alarmed these undeads. They opened their mouths slightly, and their bodies slowly recovered and sat up. Dean didn't pay attention to them. He turned around and kicked a skeleton on the subway seat next to him to the ground. It fell to the ground and broke into pieces. He gently put Aisha on the chair and sat down. At this time, the undeads had completely woken up. They sat up straight from the seat like evil spirits. Their eyes flashed with green light. They looked at Dean, who had his back to them. They stood up silently, raised their sharp claws, and rushed toward Dean. "Borrow it." Dean saw the dagger on Aisha's leg and said. He didn't wait for her to answer and quickly pulled it out. His body suddenly turned, and then he returned to the appearance of facing Aisha. He inserted the dagger back into her leg. Okay. As soon as the words fell, several bangs sounded. Several heads of the undeads that rushed to Dean from behind slid down from their necks and fell to the ground. Their bodies were out of balance and fell straight down. The blood in the wound seemed to have frozen and did not sputter out. Aisha looked up at Dean. Her lips moved slightly, and she whispered, "Thank you." Dean smiled. "You have saved me so many times. Always give me a chance to repay you. It's just a little effort for me to save you." Aisha said weakly. She felt that her vision was getting more and more blurred. She knew that she couldn't hold on for a long time. She said weakly, "I'm going to sleep. Help me guard. Don't let anyone know my whereabouts." Chapter 551. As soon as Dean agreed, he saw Aisha close her eyes, raise her head, fall on the chair, and fall asleep. He was slightly startled and suddenly realized that the girl had reached her limit by holding on until now, which also showed that her injury was far more serious than he had imagined. Speaking of which, to be able to kill a legendary hunter who hunts legendary monsters as food, this kind of power is also terrible. It should also be a dominating force among the pioneers. His eyes flashed slightly. Holding Aisha's shoulder, he put her body on the chair steadily and lay down. At this time, he noticed that the armor on Aisha's body was on the verge of disintegration. The special metal texture of the armor was full of cracks. It was not difficult to imagine what kind of impact it had suffered. He carefully looked up and down and found the wounds on her body. In addition to some flesh abrasions on her arms, there were 3 really serious wounds. One was on the left thigh, where the armor was scratched and the flesh inside was badly mutilated. The second wound was on the back, where the armor was also torn and there was a nearly 20-centimeter long scratch inside. The wound was very deep, and the blood had turned black. The wound exuded a faint smell, which seemed to be infected with germs. The third wound was on the head, where there was an obvious bruise on the temple, and the flesh was sunken by half an inch. Dean frowned slightly, pondered a little, and turned his head to look around. He saw that in the other subway carriages on the left and right, there was a thick layer of dust on the ground, as well as the corpses of rats and other unknown insects and several sleeping undeads. Dean immediately pulled out the dagger on Aisha's leg, rushed to the left subway carriage, and killed several undeads who had not yet woken up, cutting off their heads. This dagger was extremely sharp. The cervical vertebrae in their heads were cut by the dagger, but it was like cutting tofu, and there was almost no stagnation. Whoosh! Whoosh! Dean swept along the subway carriage, killing the sleeping undeads on the ground one by one. A few minutes later, he swept all the undeads in the entire subway carriage and killed them with the dagger. In addition to the undead, the small monsters such as the strange insects and the demonic spiders that built their nests in the subway car were also killed by him one by one, leaving no survivors in the entire subway car. Dean returned to Aisha's side. He took out purified water from his backpack and washed the dagger. Then he used a match to ignite the kerosene to make a torch. When the dagger turned red, he drank a mouthful of purified water and sprayed it on the dagger. Then he turned Aisha's body over and let her lie on the chair. He put the dagger aside and used both hands to pull the armor on Aisha's back. He tore it a little bit bigger. The material of this armor was shockingly tough. He had to use all his strength to barely tear a bigger hole in it. There was a layer of white undergarments inside the armor. At this moment, it was also dyed red with blood. She peeled it off, revealing the wound inside. Dean's pupils shrank when he saw the wound. He saw that the wound had turned purple, and the blood that seeped out showed signs of blistering. Obviously, it contained highly toxic poison. The blistering blood attached to the wound, causing the flesh to gradually fester. Dean no longer hesitated. He grabbed the sterilized dagger, took a deep breath, and cut off the rotten flesh along the edge of the festering wound. At the same time, Dean glanced at Aisha's reaction. Seeing that she was still unconscious, he was relieved in his heart. At the same time, he was a little worried. Obviously, things were not as easy as she said. It was just asleep. She had lost consciousness. Dean moved quickly. He cut along the edge of the wound and soon removed the festering flesh covered with poison. However, after removing part of the flesh, the blood that seeped out from the wound still had subtle bubbles, which gradually eroded the white skin next to it. There were faint signs of festering. Damn, the poison has penetrated too deep. Dean frowned. He rummaged through his backpack and found 2 bottles of detoxification and analgesia powder. One was his, and the other was Ruby's. The 2 were different types of powder with different purposes. Dean took out Ruby's powder and sprinkled it. Compared with the powder that he received for free, Ruby's powder was exchanged with a metal. The effect was much better than his. It could alleviate the poisoned person's state. If it was the poison of some small poisonous insects, it would be solved on the spot. Russell, after the powder was sprinkled, Dean looked at it attentively. He suddenly saw that the blood that seeped out from the wound was still small and black in color. It was not neutralized by the powder. Instead, the powder was quickly eroded by the poisonous blood. The color became black like rotten soil. Dean's face changed. He didn't expect the poison to be so severe. The poison is too deep. The powder alone can't stop it unless the blood is washed. But this requires the advanced equipment of the old era. The medical treatment of this world can't do it. Dean's face was gloomy. He looked up at the subway outside. When he saw the devastated ground outside, the idea that had just emerged in his heart was immediately dispelled. 300 years had passed. Most of the equipment in the hospital had long been corroded by the air and could not be used. Even if he found it, it would be a pile of copper and iron. He looked down at the unconscious Aisha. He was a little anxious. Did he want to watch her pass out? He opened the backpack and shook it upside down. All the things inside fell to the ground. He immediately grabbed 2 bottles of healing powder and opened the bottle. First, he used a dagger to scrape out the black powder on her wound. Then he poured the red healing powder in the bottle. After a while, the red powder slowly penetrated into her blood. At the same time, the blood that kept seeping out gradually stopped overflowing. Seeing that it was effective, Dean was stunned for a moment. He was overjoyed. He immediately took out a clean towel and stuck it on the wound. The towel sucked clean the black blood that had previously seeped out, and then he poured the healing powder on it. Soon, the wound stopped bleeding. Dean was relieved. He took out a roll of gauze and covered the wound with 2 layers to prevent the dust in the air and the parasites that were invisible to the naked eye from falling into her wound and causing it to be infected again. After doing this, Dean took out pure water, lifted her head, opened her mouth, and poured some water into her mouth. He let her drink it to promote the metabolism in her body so that she could wake up as soon as possible. Chapter 552. Katja. When Dean cleaned Aisha's wound, a strange sound suddenly came from outside the subway car. Dean was surprised and quickly looked at the source of the sound, but did not see the heat source. He quickly squatted down and quietly moved a step to the broken window next to him. He slowly raised half of his head and looked out. Suddenly, he was stunned. He saw a young man wearing the basic standard armor of the Dragon Guard appeared in the collapsed wall outside the subway. He raised his head and sniffed around, seeming to sense something. He followed the smell and walked toward the carriage where Dean was. His pace was a bit strange, and he staggered as he walked. Seeing this strange walking posture, Dean had a familiar feeling. He stared at it, and his face suddenly changed. He saw that the young man's armor was damaged in many places, and his cervical vertebra was tilted in a position of about 70 degrees, as if it was broken. Especially his left shoulder, which had collapsed. The shoulder was badly mutilated, as if something had torn off a piece of flesh. However, the most eye-catching thing was his face. His pupils were glowing with green light, and his mouth was slightly open. His sharp teeth were somewhat uneven and stained with blood. Undead? Dean was a little surprised. He did not expect that this was a dragon guard infected by the undead virus. Was there a Corpse King-level undead around here? During the time he spent with Ian and others, Dean knew some things about the wasteland, as well as the monsters that often appeared in the wasteland and needed to be vigilant, including the Corpse King. The so-called Corpse King was a super undead that had mutated many times. Its hunting level was extremely high. Even the lowest Corpse King's hunting level was above 40, and the stronger Corpse King's hunting level was even above 90. The only difference between the Corpse King and the undead was that the Corpse King could reproduce monogamously and give birth to new undead. In addition, the Corpse King seemed to be able to control ordinary undead. Usually, the place where the Corpse King appeared was often a corpse tide. Even the strong pioneers did not want to encounter such a troublesome monster as the Corpse King. The undead virus that can infect the Dragon Guard mostly comes from the Corpse King. Dean's face changed slightly. In other words, there's a Corpse King in the number 3 Orange Wasteland. The danger of the Corpse King was no less than the legendary monster. Moreover, unlike the legendary monster, the Corpse King did not have a treasure comparable to the legendary parasitic soulworm, so no one was willing to take such a risk to kill a Corpse King. Although killing high-level monsters was the bounden duty of the pioneers, there were endless monsters in the wasteland. Unless it was an order from the superior, even the pioneers would stay away. Dean was surprised. The Dragon Guard zombie seemed to smell the blood from Aisha's wound. He swayed his body and went straight to the front of the subway carriage. His footsteps were getting faster and faster. Most of his eyes, which had shrunk several times, were involuntarily white. At this moment, his eyes were rolling, and his throat made a gurgling sound, as if he was a little excited. Dean's face sank. He raised his hand and grabbed the dagger on the chair next to him. He suddenly kicked his feet and shot straight out of the broken window. His figure was like a dim light, rushing straight to the chest of the Corpse King. Before Dean's sudden attack, the Corpse King's body suddenly paused. He slightly opened his mouth and roared hoarsely, like spitting out a sad cry, but also like a ferocious laugh. His body suddenly twisted, like a flexible python. He dodged Dean's dagger that was aimed at his throat. He leaned back and fell down with his hands on the ground. He somersaulted several times and opened the distance. Dean was shocked. This Corpse King actually knew how to dodge, and his movements were so coherent. It was totally different from the previous stiff and weird walking posture. Whoosh! As soon as he opened the distance, the Corpse King growled, like crying and screaming, but his expression was extremely ferocious. He suddenly rushed toward Dean. The figure that rushed was not like the ordinary corpses that bare their fangs and brandish their claws. Instead, it was like a smart assassin. Its steps were brisk, leaving an afterimage in Dean's sight, and then disappeared. The next moment, it suddenly appeared on Dean's left side. Dean sensed it and looked over in horror. He suddenly saw the Corpse King raise its ferocious face, roaring and rushing toward him. Puff! Its mouth full of sharp teeth fiercely bit Dean's left shoulder. Its two hands hugged Dean's body tightly. Its strength was surprisingly strong, completely not like the strength that an ordinary Dragon Guard should have. It was far beyond Dean's imagination. Dean saw that his left arm was bitten by the Corpse King. Although there was no pain, his heart was a little panicked. It must be known that the Corpse King's teeth had the Corpse King virus. Once he was bitten by it, he would also be infected. He hurriedly broke free, but the Corpse King's hands tightly hugged his body. The terrifying strength squeezed his body to the point that it almost broke. Such strength was several times stronger than him, and it was definitely not something that a limitless being could have. Dean's face changed. His heart was anxious and angry, and there was a trace of fear. He twisted his arm, trying to break free from the Corpse King's embrace, but his arm could not move at all. He hurriedly rolled his body on the ground, rolling several times on the ground with the Corpse King. The Corpse King did not seem to feel pain. It still hugged him tightly and kept biting his shoulder. The armor outside the shoulder had been torn, and the flesh inside was also bitten off. "Do you want to eat me alive like this?" Dean saw the Corpse King's crazy appearance, and the fear in his heart turned into anger. He suddenly raised his head and slammed his forehead on the Corpse King's skull. With a bang, the Corpse King's head was hit. Its hands suddenly loosened, and it seemed to be a little dizzy. Dean did not expect it to work. At this moment, he got the opportunity. He hurriedly raised his right hand, clenched the dagger, and stabbed it into the Corpse King's eye socket. Puff! The Corpse King could not react in time, and the dagger immediately penetrated its eye socket. Roar! It screamed, but the sound was like the roar of a beast. Its vocal cords seemed to be more seriously damaged. It howled in pain, and from time to time, the howling sound turned into a human voice like crying. Dean gritted his teeth and turned the dagger. Puff! The dagger stirred up a stream of blood from its eye socket. As the dagger swayed left and right, the Corpse King's screams became louder and louder. When the dagger swung towards the inside of its skull, its screams suddenly stopped, and its struggling hand stiffened. Then it powerlessly fell to the ground and stopped moving. Chapter 553. Dean pushed the corpse to the side, immediately turned over and sat up, checking the wound on his left hand. He saw that the armor on his arm was bitten off, and the muscles inside were also bitten off. The wound was bloody. If it was someone else, such an injury would have been too painful to speak, but his left hand had no feeling, which made him have a strange feeling, as if he was looking at someone else's wound. Only when he was hurt by someone else, he would not feel pain. However, this was, after all, an illusion. He turned his head and pulled out the dagger from the young undead's eye socket. He returned to the subway car, wiped the blood with a towel, washed it with purified water, and then disinfected it on the torch. When the dagger was burned red, he lifted the armor on his arm and used the hot dagger to scrape the blood on the edge of the wound on his shoulder. He only heard the sound of water evaporating from the wound. After scraping the minced meat, Dean suddenly found that there was not much blood flowing out of the wound on his arm. He was startled and suddenly thought of a terrible thing. He stared at it, and suddenly the blood seemed to stagnate, flowing slowly. He touched it with his right hand, and suddenly felt an icy coldness. This familiar coldness, he knew that it came from the ice blood disease, but seeing this scene at the moment let him come up with a ridiculous idea. His left hand seemed to be no different from the body of the undead. The only difference was that although the skin was pale, it was not attached with a touch of lifeless stone gray. Is it possible that the ice blood disease is a precursor to the undead? Dean could not help but think, and then he felt that it was not the case. According to the time he knew from others, the undead generally took a few hours. Even those with strong resistance could barely hold on for about 7 or 8 hours, and then they would be completely eroded by the virus. But he had the ice blood disease for several years. If he was an undead, he would have become an undead long ago. However, the appearance and symptoms of his left hand at the moment were no different from those of the undead. They were all injured, but there was no large amount of bleeding, and the blood in the body was extremely cold. This caused him to be slightly puzzled. Could it be that there's a deeper connection between the two? His eyes flashed slightly, and after a while, he collected his thoughts. He used the dagger to cut along the bite mark of the young undead. He saw that the flesh near the bite mark was darker. He used the dagger to cut a 4 or 5 centimeter scratch along the bite mark. He stared at it and found that the flesh was brighter 2 centimeters away from the bite mark. The closer it was to the bite mark, the darker the color. Seeing that his guess was right, he breathed a sigh of relief. Sure enough, the inhibitory flow of the ice blood disease worked at this moment. The virus in the young undead's teeth did not spread as fast as it would in an ordinary human body. Instead, it spread at a relatively slow speed, which was enough for him to take precautions. This strange disease is not completely useless, Dudian thought. He didn't hesitate to use a dagger to cut off the bite marks and the flesh around it. Then he washed it with a mixture of disinfectant powder and purified water. Then he wrapped it in gauze and waited for the new flesh to grow. If this kind of injury was inflicted on an ordinary person, a few large scars would definitely be left on their arms. However, for existences like them who had extraordinary physiques, as long as they took good care of themselves and were provided with sufficient nutrition, such injuries would recover sooner or later. It was just like how an ordinary person would quickly recover from a minor scratch. After all, while their physiques were strengthened, the automatic recovery ability of their cells was also far superior to that of ordinary people. After dealing with the wound, Dean sat on the chair and rested. After recovering some physical strength, he got up and came to the body of the young undead. He looked at it and suddenly noticed that the nails of the undead were stained with dried blood. The smell was actually the smell of human blood. Obviously, in addition to him, the young undead had also attacked others. Dean gently sniffed and suddenly felt that the smell of blood was a bit familiar. He thought a little and suddenly remembered that when Ian and others first came to the wasteland, they saw the corpse of the dragon guard with half of its skull bitten off. The smell of blood was exactly the same. So, is it the one who killed that person? Dean's eyes flashed. He did not expect that after the young undead killed that person, it wandered back to the depths of the orange wasteland number 3 and met him. He had to say that it was a kind of fate. Martin said that the mutation speed of the undead is faster than that of the monsters. To some extent, the undead retain the characteristics of humans' rapid evolution. As long as there is energy, they can quickly improve and transform. Moreover, humans are different from the undead. Humans can only take God's blessing, but the undead can eat anything. They absorb nutrients from the corpses of monsters or the same kind. Their mutation speed is far beyond that of humans. This person's team was most likely attacked by the Corpse King. After he was infected and turned into an undead, he should have eaten many times. Whether his strength or speed, he is stronger than senior hunters like Eugene and Martin. He should be at the level of pioneer. Dean looked at its body. His eyes flashed. He suddenly lifted his foot and stepped on its skull. Gotcha! The skull made the sound of bones breaking. He lifted his foot again and stomped hard. After repeating this several times, he finally crushed the young undead's head. Even the brain inside the head collapsed, as if he was stepping on wet soil. He squatted down and picked up a stone from the side. He fiddled with the brain and soon found a hard object inside it. It was the cold crystal. However, to his surprise, the cold crystal in the head of the young undead, although it was blue in color, had some changes in shape. It was not round, but oval, and there were fine protruding spikes on the surface like small bumps. Dean put on the ground. After thinking for a moment, he stretched out his left index finger and touched it gently. It was cold, no different from the cold crystal. He was relieved. He took out the dirty towel that he used to wipe the cold crystal. When he looked at it again, after wiping it clean, he suddenly found that there was a small shadow in the cold crystal. He was a little surprised. He returned to the subway car and raised the torch to look at it. Under the illumination of the flame, he saw the shadow in the cold crystal, like a twisted worm. Dean was startled. He suddenly remembered that the young undead was originally a dragon guard. There were magic marks in his body. Was his magic mark in the cold crystal at the moment? Why did such a phenomenon appear? Bang! While he was thinking, a loud noise suddenly came from outside the subway car. Chapter 554. Another one. Dean looked at the outline of the heat source and knew that it was a powerful monster. He looked through the broken window and saw a nearly 3-meter-high monster lying on the ground. It looked like a toad, bloated, with fine green scales on its surface. There were spikes of different lengths on its thick forelimbs and shoulders. It was a level 42 serpent toad. Dean's face changed slightly. This was a highly poisonous monster. Although its level was 42, which was equivalent to a primary frontiersman. If not careful, even a pioneer would die tragically under its venom. Ordinary antidote powder could not suppress its venom. Even the top pharmacist of the Dark Church, who was good at developing poisons, might not be able to save the life of a person who was poisoned by the serpent toad. Damn it, Dean cursed in his heart. He did not expect that these troublesome monsters would appear one after another in such a hidden place. He glanced at the unconscious Aisha on the chair next to him. His eyes flickered slightly. If he left this girl at the moment, he could cut a few wounds on her body and use her to distract the serpent toad's attention. He would have some hope to sneak away from the side. However, when he saw Aisha's pale face in a coma, he could not help but think of the dragon prison and the help he gave her on that rainy night many years ago. The idea in his heart was immediately dispelled. If it was someone else, he might not hesitate to betray them, but this girl had saved him several times. It was somewhat difficult for him to abandon her. I can only give it a try. He slightly gritted his teeth, clenched the dagger, and looked at the serpent toad jumping toward the subway car. His eyes slightly narrowed, and a trace of cold, killing intent flashed through them. He grabbed a dusty shoe from the ground and threw it toward the side of the serpent toad's body. Bang! The shoe fell to the ground. The sound attracted the attention of the serpent toad. When its eyes looked over, Dean suddenly rushed out. Like an arrow leaving the bow, he jumped out of the window and went straight to the front of the serpent toad. The serpent toad suddenly reacted. It opened its bright red and slender tongue, which rolled toward Dean like an intestine. At the front of the tongue, there was a slightly cracked mouth with fine teeth. Dean's body suddenly flashed, and he dodged the bright red tongue. His full burst of speed allowed his body to sweep like a gust of wind. He appeared at the side of the serpent toad, and the dagger fiercely stabbed at its eyeball. The serpent toad could not react and only had time to close its eyes. Puff! The dagger was extremely sharp and easily pierced through its eyelids. Green blood spurted out from the inside and splashed on Dean's armor. The metal armor was corroded, and the white of the dagger's eyes suddenly appeared. Dudian was surprised. He used his injured left hand to press on its body. He used the dagger to stab the top of its head. The serpent toad roared, and the tongue in its mouth shot back toward Dean. At the same time, the spikes on its forelimbs suddenly grew like several sharp claws, stabbing toward Dean on its back. Dean noticed that the tips of these spikes were overflowing with a faint green liquid. He expected that it was highly toxic. His heart shivered, and the dagger quickly stabbed toward the serpent toad's head. After piercing the scales on the top of the serpent toad's head, it seemed to be against a hard bone. He did not dare to continue to use force. He quickly pulled out the dagger, turned over, and slid down its body. As he landed, he kicked it in the back, trying to deal as much damage as he could. Whoosh! As soon as he landed, the three tails behind the serpent toad suddenly swung toward him. The tails were full of protruding spikes. Once he touched them, he would definitely be injured. The serpent toad's whole body was poisonous. Once he was injured, he would be in big trouble. This was also the reason why Dean did not want to fight with it. Dean saw three shadows sweeping towards him. His heart beat fiercely, and the blood in his whole body seemed to burn in an instant. His body suddenly twisted, as if there were several invisible limbs supporting his body. He crawled with his back to the ground in a strange posture like a spider crawling. He narrowly escaped, and at the same time quickly pulled back the distance. Hiss! The serpent toad made a snake-like hissing sound. It turned around and quickly jumped toward Dean. The bone spikes on its body suddenly opened like a peacock spreading its tail. Dean's face was ugly. He stared at the serpent toad. At the moment when the serpent toad pounced on him, his body suddenly soared into the air. He flapped his wings and flew high into the sky. At the same time, his hand swung out a black shadow and smashed it toward the other eye of the serpent toad. The serpent toad's tongue suddenly danced and hit the black shadow. With a bang, it exploded and turned into a cloud of dust. This object turned out to be a concrete stone that Dean picked up from the ground. At the moment when the stone was smashed, Dean's body suddenly swooped down and hit the serpent toad's head head-on. The dagger instantly pierced the scales on its head. With a click, it broke through the skull and penetrated the handle of the dagger. At the same time, he raised his left hand and smashed toward the serpent toad's head. At this moment, he didn't care about his left hand's injury. He used all his strength to hammer the serpent toad's head. The serpent toad screamed. Its whole body trembled in pain. Its tongue danced wildly and whipped Dean's body. The sharp teeth at the front of the tongue opened its mouth and bit Dean's right shoulder. Feeling the sharp pain in his shoulder, Dean's eyes were a little red. He hammered harder, pulled out the dagger, and stabbed it again and again. He stabbed it more than a dozen times until the serpent toad under him completely stopped moving. Dean felt a burning pain on his wrist. He looked down and saw that the blood of the serpent toad had corroded the wrist guard and flowed to his wrist. He hurriedly jumped down from the serpent toad's back. After landing, he took 2 breaths. Seeing that the serpent toad was no longer moving, he was a little relieved. Then he immediately looked at several places on his body where the pain was coming from. He couldn't help but feel a chill in his heart. He saw that there was a big bite mark on his right shoulder. Although it didn't tear off the flesh, the bite mark was relatively deep and tore the armor. In addition, there were 2 abrasions on his wrist and back. There was a dent on the wing on his back, as if it was poked by a hard object. Dean hurriedly returned to the subway car, took off the armor, and wrapped the wound with a bandage to prevent the poisonous blood from spreading. At the same time, he washed and disinfected the dagger. He gouged out the bite mark on his right shoulder. He saw that the flesh of the wound was somewhat rotten, and the blood was also faintly dark green, which was extremely strange and frightening. However, when cleaning the wound, Dean saw that the dark green blood didn't spread too far, only a few centimeters. Seeing this familiar appearance, he was startled for a moment, and his heart was suddenly relieved. He didn't expect that his ice blood disease had a special way to resist the poison. He cleaned the wounds all over his body, smeared healing powder, and wrapped them with gauze. In the process of bandaging, he saw that his left hand was somewhat deformed, and the bones of the middle finger were displaced, which looked a bit weird. Obviously, it was caused by the previous beating too hard. When the wound was just treated, before Dean had time to rest, he heard a strange sound outside the subway car again. This time, it was the sound of footsteps. He looked up, but it was a few sickle zombies staggering. Dean cursed in his heart and turned to look at Aisha. He had noticed that the bloody smell from Aisha's wound had a strange fragrance. This place was so hidden that there were no footprints of large monsters left recently before their arrival. But in a short time after their arrival, they appeared one after another. Most of them were attracted by her strange, bloody smell. Although he didn't know why her bloody smell had such an effect, now it gave him a headache. He jumped out of the subway car, picked up some stones on the ground, aimed at the heads of several sickle zombies, and threw them out. Bang, bang, bang. The heads of several sickle zombies were hit by the stones. Their faces suddenly broke, and their bodies trembled and fell to the ground. After all, they were only level 10 monsters. In front of Dean's current strength, he could easily kill them. Dean leaned against the outside of the carriage, seizing the time to rest. At the same time, he was thinking of ways to suppress the smell of blood. The first method that came to his mind was to wrap her in a bag and seal the smell. But if it was airtight, she would suffocate to death. Do I have to fly in the sky with her? In this case, my physical strength can't support it. Dean frowned. If he was in his peak state, he could hold on for a while, but at this moment his physical strength was almost exhausted. It was estimated that he would be completely exhausted after flying with her for more than 10 minutes. As for flying directly out of the wasteland from here, it was even more impossible. Rustle. Not long after he rested, there was another sound from outside. This time it was a small sound, and the number was very large. Dean's face changed slightly, and a dense heat source appeared in his sight. It turned out to be a palm-sized insect. Outside the giant wall, insect tide, like corpse tide, was one of the scariest disasters. The danger was no less than encountering legendary monsters. Dean was just about to turn around and climb back to the subway. He picked up Haisha and ran, but he saw the heat source insects rushing to the hole outside the subway. The insects behind them were not endless. The width of the swarm was only about 10 meters. Obviously, it was not the legendary insect tide that stretched for several kilometers. He breathed a sigh of relief. Such a number could only be regarded as a small swarm. He glanced around and found some vines growing out of the cracks in the ground, as well as some wilted vines that had lost their moisture. He quickly gathered them and lit them up with a torch. Then he poured the remaining kerosene around the outside of the subway car and poured it on some green vines, igniting them. Instantly, a circle of flames appeared, protecting the subway car he was in. The swarm quickly crawled over, but stopped in front of the flame, not daring to move forward. Dean sat in the circle of fire, looking at the dense insects around him. He smiled slightly, holding the torch in his hand. He leaned his back against the car, taking the opportunity to breathe and restore his physical strength. The flame continued to burn, but the swarm gradually became a little impatient. From time to time, a few insects jumped out and tried to jump over the flame circle, but their bodies were burned by the flame. Suddenly they squeaked, but when they fell in front of Dean's feet, their bodies trembled, and they did not die. Dean's face changed slightly. He knew that this flame could not stop these insects. It could only delay a little time. Looking at the dense insects, he sighed. Although with his strength, killing these insects was as simple as trampling ants to death. When he killed all these insects, his physical strength would be completely overdrawn. Aisha was stimulated by the pain and slowly woke up. She struggled to open her eyes and suddenly saw a flame jumping in the darkness. She was startled for a moment and suddenly woke up. She hurriedly turned over and sat up, but as soon as she exerted force on her abdomen, a sharp pain came from her back, making her gasp. She could barely support her body with her hands to sit up. She only felt a burst of dizziness in her mind, which was a symptom of excessive blood loss. She turned her head to look at the flame and was stunned. She saw a dense swarm of insects surrounding the flame. Some of them were crawling on the iron sheet above her head, making a rustling sound. In the circle of flame, a teenager with black hair was sitting on the edge of the iron sheet next to her. He was staring at the swarm in front of him without squinting. It was Dean, who she had seen before. The memories from before she fainted suddenly came flooding back like a tide. She was startled for a moment and looked down at her arm. She felt something and raised her hand to touch her head. She immediately felt a soft gauze. Her lips moved slightly, and she looked up at the black-haired youth who had his back against her. She listened to the whispers of the swarm of insects outside the flames, and a strange look slowly appeared in her eyes. Dean heard the movement behind him. His eyes moved and saw that Aisha had woken up. He couldn't help but say, "You woke up." Aisha gently nodded and moved her eyes away from the back of his head. She glanced at the surrounding insects and whispered, "Have you been fighting here when I was in a coma?" Dean said, "Yes, I don't know where these monsters came from. They don't let me rest." Aisha faintly said, "You can leave so as not to be implicated by me. From childhood to adulthood, people who are close to me don't have a good end." Dean was startled. He suddenly thought of the childhood she told him in prison. He was silent for a moment and whispered, "You are right." Aisha was startled. She didn't expect him to admit this. Her heart was suddenly inexplicably sour. She slightly gritted her teeth and said, "You can leave. I will help you restrain." But Dean interrupted her again. He turned his head to look at her and smiled. "I like this kind of implication." Aisha stared at him blankly, suddenly speechless. Dean turned his head and stared at the swarm in front of him again. He saw that as the flame was getting weaker, some insects rushed through the flame and crawled to his feet from time to time. He killed them, but as time passed, the number of insects crawling in front of him increased. "I didn't expect that one day I would be bullied by these little insects." Dean shook his head with a wry smile and said to Aisha, "Let's change places." Chapter 555. Insect Repellent Powder. Dean was surprised. He didn't expect her to carry such a thing with her. He took a look and asked, "Is it effective? Try it. It should work." There was a smile on Aisha's pale and haggard face. It was as if a ray of light suddenly bloomed in the darkness. Dean was slightly startled, but he was quickly pulled back by the squeaking sound of the insects. He quickly looked down at the bottle in his hand again, and no longer said anything. He unscrewed the bottle, and a strange stench with a hint of sulfur hit his face. He poured some powder into his hand and threw it at the swarm outside the fire ring. The powder quickly poured down like rain. Dean stared at it and saw a commotion in the swarm. The swarm squeaked as if it had encountered something extremely frightened. The swarm's lineup suddenly became chaotic. Dean was overjoyed. He didn't expect the insect repellent powder to be so effective. He immediately poured the insect repellent powder inside the fire ring and then poured out a cluster. He held it in his hand and mixed it with the sand and dust on the ground. He threw it at the swarm. The swarm of insects was in chaos. The neat formation that was like a piece of black cloth was instantly torn apart and fled in all directions. Dean exhaled, screwed the bottle cap, and handed it back to Aisha. "It's a big help." Aisha took it and put it in her waist bag. She smiled. "This time thanks to you, otherwise." She didn't finish her words. Suddenly her cheeks bulged, and she coughed out a mouthful of blood. The blood splashed on the chair. Dean was shocked. He quickly climbed into the carriage. "Are you okay? Did it affect your wound?" Aisha's face became paler after coughing out blood. She shook her head slightly and said weakly, "It's okay. I'm just poisoned too deeply. It has penetrated deep into my organs. I can't hold on any longer. You better leave here quickly. Otherwise, you will die with me." Dean couldn't help but look at her waist bag. "Isn't there any antidote in it? There should be something that can delay it. Tell me the location of the headquarters in the wasteland, and I will send you there. I can fly, so I will send you to the headquarters soon." "The headquarters is too far." Aisha shook her head slightly. "Moreover, it is the deepest border of the Red Wasteland. Even if you fly there, it will take a lot of time. Moreover, it is very dangerous to fly in the Red Wasteland. It is not like the hunter's area outside the giant wall. There are few birds and beasts here. Flying monsters are the most difficult monsters to deal with. If it is not necessary, it is best not to fly. It is easy to attract the attention of some monsters." Dean was startled. He suddenly thought of the wyvern he had seen on the giant wall. Although the legend says that wyvern doesn't hurt people, but it is at least a kind of flying monster. Since there is a wyvern, then there will be other flying monsters. But he had never seen it in the hunter's area, so he even ignored it. But this was the most remote wasteland from the giant wall. There was no development of the original radiation area, so naturally there were all kinds of monsters. "Did you come out alone?" Dean suddenly thought of something and immediately asked, "Did you come here to chase after that winged family member? Didn't you bring your teammates?" "Yes." Aisha slightly moved the corner of her mouth and said, "It is too slow for me to search for him alone. I brought 2 exploration teams. They are nearby, but we must not be seen by them. Otherwise, if they know my current physical condition, they will attack us first." "How is it possible?" Dean was a little surprised. Then he thought of something and couldn't help but change his expression. "Is there Hathaway's people among them?" Aisha was silent for a moment and nodded. "This is one thing. Even if there is no one among them, the rest will not let go of this opportunity. Once they kill me, they can get my magic weapon. This magic weapon can only be used by the pure-blooded dragon family. They can either give it to the Wing family or the Rock family and rely on them, or give it to Hathaway in exchange for status and power. Many years ago, Hathaway publicly spread the news that she is against me and the family. This is a well-known thing." Dean couldn't help but stare at her. He was angry and said, "Aren't you the dragon family's saint? How can they do this to you? Aren't they your subordinates? Moreover, since Hathaway started to attack you many years ago, why didn't you get rid of her earlier? The people here are eager to return to the wall to rest. The long battle has long made them lose loyalty and humanity." Aisha glanced at him and said, "I promise to protect Hathaway until she grows up, so—" Dean choked and said angrily, "Promised? Promised who? Your father?" Aisha shook her head slightly and didn't want to talk about it anymore. Suddenly, she frowned and a trace of blood slowly overflowed from the corner of her mouth. She raised her hand and wiped it. She took a deep breath and said to Dean, "I can't hold it anymore. You should go quickly. My blood will attract high-level monsters. You will only die if you stay here. Go quickly. I don't want to drag someone down with me before I die." Her voice gradually weakened as she spoke. Her eyes turned black and she fainted again. Her body softly fell down. Dean hurried to support her. He glanced at the wound on her back and found that the color of the gauze was a bit black. The poisonous blood had actually seeped out. The wound couldn't heal under the corrosion of the poison. His face changed. As Aisha said, the poison had penetrated too deep. Unless the best treatment was given immediately, there was no way to save the situation. Damn it. Dean was angry. He was angry at the cruel situation in front of him. He was angry at his inability to change the situation. He gritted his teeth and turned to look outside the subway. He saw that the swarm had retreated one after another. The smell of insect repellent had spread out and scared away the swarm. However, the smell of Aisha's blood drifted out again. It was estimated that it wouldn't be long before new monsters would be attracted. He clenched his fist and slammed it on the chair. Suddenly, a fist mark was formed. He looked at the unconscious Aisha in his hand. His eyes flashed with a trace of struggle. In the current situation, the most appropriate way was to abandon her. But deep in his heart, he felt that once he did so, he might regret it for the rest of his life. Aisha was the only person who had saved him several times, but he had no way to repay her. Except for his parents, sister, and Jura couple, he had never owed anyone a favor. Even old Feline had a friendship with him. But this girl had completely helped him and didn't try to get any return from him. Damn it. Damn it. Damn it. Chapter 556. It was an exhaust fan on a subway air conditioner. It was covered with dust and looked ordinary. The moment Dean saw this thing, he thought of several things in his mind. Exhaust fan, air conditioner, low temperature ice. That's right, it was ice. His eyes lit up. In this ruined city in the wilderness, all the things from the old era were either rusted or destroyed by weathering. It was almost impossible to find an airtight bag that could seal the smell of blood on Aisha's body. But there was one thing that could do it, and that was ice. Now is the black snow season. The temperature is low, so it's easy to get ice. Dean's eyes flashed slightly as he looked outside the subway carriage. Gusts of cold wind blew in through the broken window. He could vaguely see the hazy sky outside. It was estimated that there would be heavy snow soon. However, he didn't intend to wait for the snow. This kind of thing that left fate to God's arrangement was never his first choice. Moreover, the falling black snow contained too much nuclear fallout. Not to mention nuclear radiation. Because of the nuclear fallout, the black snow couldn't accumulate into ice like ordinary snow. Instead, it would be like loose sand that couldn't be mixed. I can only make ice by myself. If it snows now, I can use the low temperature of the black snow to condense the water into ice. But looking at the weather, even if it snows, it may be tomorrow or the day after tomorrow. I can't wait that long. Dean's eyes swept around the collapsed wall outside the subway. He didn't find what he wanted. It should be because the humidity here was not heavy enough. He glanced at Aisha, who was lying on the chair, took a deep breath, and said, "I hope your luck won't be so bad." He no longer hesitated and quickly drilled out of the window. He quickly came to the outside of the collapsed subway. He flapped his wings and flew up. He turned his head to look at the surrounding buildings. Suddenly, he saw a collapsed building near the collapsed subway. The building was entangled with large vines and covered with a thick layer of moss. Dean's eyes lit up and quickly landed. At the same time, he kept part of his attention to the vicinity of the subway. Once a monster appeared, he would immediately rush back to stop it. Found it. When he landed outside the building and pushed aside a vine, he immediately saw a cluster of snow-white granular stones stuck to the building like frost at the corner of the wall where the building was in contact with the ground. His eyes lit up, and he quickly broke it off and tossed it into his backpack. Then he quickly collected along the corner of the wall, removing all the white, granular stones that were stuck to the building. Good luck. Duddy didn't think that it would be so easy to find so much saltpeter. This substance was one of the components of gunpowder. When combined with sulfur, a powerful gunpowder could be made. The principle behind it was its strong ability to absorb heat. This saltpeter usually grew in shady corners, caves, and other places. It was a natural, and was also an excellent material for making ice quickly. Soon, Dean had collected a backpack full of saltpeter. He was also holding a handful of saltpeter in his hand. He had collected all the saltpeter under the collapsed building. Due to the angle of the building, the corner of the wall was not exposed to sunlight all year round. That was why so much saltpeter had grown. The reason why Dean thought of making his own ice was that he had seen saltpeter growing on the walls of the ruins many times in the wilderness. Whoosh! His figure quickly returned to the front of the subway carriage and went in. He glanced at the still unconscious Aisha and knew that her body was being eroded by the poison. He sighed in his heart and reached out to take out a rusty metal sheet from the subway carriage. He rolled a handful of saltpeter in his hand into a ball. This tough iron sheet was like paper in his hand. He kneaded it at will, and soon it became a completely sealed metal ball wrapped in saltpeter. He stuffed the ball into his backpack, then carried Aisha with both hands and quickly rushed out of the subway carriage. Although he had found the material for making ice, there was too much smell of blood in this place. He had to leave as soon as possible. It was not suitable as a hiding place. Moreover, he had to find a place close to a water source. Previously, when he was looking for a hiding place with the shadow hunter eggs, he had flown over a lot of places. Among them, there were several places with water sources. He immediately rushed to the nearest water source hiding place. Whoosh! While flying at high altitude, Dean suddenly noticed that there was a rumbling sound coming from the ground. He saw a few monsters nearly 3 meters tall, strong, and wolf-like figures rushing down the street. Their direction was the direction of the subway, where he was previously hiding. He secretly rejoiced in his heart. Fortunately, it didn't take much time to find the saltpeter, otherwise Aisha would be in danger. The hunting monsters didn't notice Dean passing by in the sky. Both of them quickly crossed each other and went far away from each other. 7 or 8 minutes later, Dean finally arrived at the place where the water source was more abundant. It was a collapsed square. The road surface of the square had completely sunken, and there was a big pit at the bottom of the square. After years of accumulated rain, it had become a big pool. Dean's thermal vision saw that there were only some red heat sources as thick as a finger in this sunken square pool. It should be the germs that fell into the water from the monsters that had been drinking here for a long time. He stared at it, and his pupils shrank slightly. The pool in his sight seemed to become a lot more transparent, and he saw an underground drainage channel under the pool. He looked in the direction of the channel and didn't see any heat sources. He no longer hesitated. He covered Aisha's nose and mouth with one hand and held her body with the other. He quickly swooped down and crashed into the square pool. Splashing high waves, he rushed into the water at full speed with Aisha in his arms. His legs were swinging, but his wings were still flapping vigorously. His wings were not feathers, but a kind of hard shell-like wings after the skin layer hardened, which could also be used as a help in the water. Whoosh! His body swam straight, and his speed was so fast that even ordinary fish might not be able to swim as fast as him at the moment. The tiny heat sources scattered all over the pool seemed to sense the movement and quickly swam in Dean's direction. But their speed was relatively slow, so they couldn't catch up with Dean. They just followed behind him and soon gathered in groups. They chased after Dean along the flow of water, seemingly sucking the blood diluted from Aisha's wounds along the way. Dean quickly swam to an underground drainage channel connected to the pool and swam along the channel. His pupils were always in a state of miniature, so the things in front of him became a little transparent, and he could see the scene in front of the channel. He swam quickly around the corner of several channels, and suddenly saw a dark cave-like channel. Chapter 557. After coming ashore, Dean glanced around. The scene here was the same as what he had seen from the translucent vision. It was a collapsed basement. The top of the basement was surrounded by messy layers of reinforced concrete stones. The messy stacking of the stones caused the place to not be completely filled up. Instead, there was a bulge of less than 2 meters in height in an area of about 10 square meters. Next to the scattered stones, a submerged car hood was vaguely visible, and it was covered with dust. Previously, when he came in, Dean noticed that the place where the drainage channel was connected to was the bottom of the collapsed building. From the outside, only the foundation of the building remained. Next to the foundation was a ruined stone hill. This was the most ideal hiding place he could find at present. He retracted his gaze and put Aisha on the ground at his feet. He checked the wound on her back. Because she had been soaked in radioactive water, the gauze outside the wound was completely dyed red. He immediately opened his backpack and poured out the saltpeter inside. Then he took out the gauze at the bottom of the backpack and peeled off some of Aisha's armor. He took off the gauze on her body and wrung it dry. He wiped the water near her wound and then replaced it with a new gauze. After doing this, he immediately poured out all the things in the backpack and put them aside. Then he used the backpack as a water container and put it into a drainage channel the size of a well to fill it with water. The backpack was waterproof. After he filled it with water, he poured some water on the surrounding concrete stones. The exposed steel bars in these stones had long been rusted and rotten. At this moment, when he poured water on the stones, they immediately became muddy. Sure enough, it won't work. Dean immediately stopped and thought for a moment. He threw the backpack aside and picked up 2 pieces of saltpeter. He rubbed them together and ground them into fine powder fragments. Then he lifted the backpack again and slowly poured a small amount of the ground saltpeter into the backpack. At the same time, he observed the changes in the backpack. As the saltpeter entered the water, its heat absorption characteristics immediately came into play. The water in the backpack gradually turned white and froze at a speed visible to the naked eye. It didn't take long for the water to completely freeze into a block of ice. Dean patted the backpack to loosen the ice inside. Then he poured it out, and immediately a rectangular backpack-shaped ice block appeared. A bit too much saltpeter. Dean glanced at the ice cube and put it on the ground. Then he continued to fill the backpack with water and grind the saltpeter. He added a small amount of saltpeter and observed the changes in the water to prevent wasting saltpeter. More than an hour passed by. Dean had made more than 50 pieces of ice and piled them high around the collapsed stone cave. He stopped making ice and moved the ice around the cave. Using the ice as bricks, he piled them up and built an oval barrier along the edge of the collapsed stone. After the rough shape of the ice barrier was completed, he measured the size of some of the gaps that were exposed at the corners. Then he used his backpack to fill it with water and molded it into the corresponding shape. Afterwards, he threw in the fragments of saltpeter and immediately created ice cubes to fill the gaps. Then he stuffed them into the gaps of the ice barrier. When 2/3 of the saltpeter had been used, a sealed barrier made of ice was finally formed. Dean filled his backpack with water and sprinkled it on the ice bricks from top to bottom. The water slowly flowed along the ice bricks and gradually froze. The gaps of the ice bricks were completely glued together, forming an absolute seal. Dean was so tired that he sat on the ground. Although he was very tired, he didn't feel hot or sweaty. Instead, his whole body was cold. His hands kept making ice and piling up the bricks until he lost consciousness. He turned his head and looked at Aisha, who was lying in the middle of the ice barrier. The latter was still unconscious. Her face was pale and bloodless. Her brows were slightly wrinkled. She seemed to be very uncomfortable. Dean dragged his tired body forward to check her wound. He saw a drooping bloodstain on the gauze on her back, but it didn't spread too much. The amount of bleeding seemed to be under control for the time being. He sighed softly. Although the injury was stabilized, the toxins in her body were raging in her body. There was no cure. In the end, it was just a slow death. Cold air came from all directions. Dean's body shivered. He couldn't help but rub his hands together. When his right hand touched his left hand, He was shocked. It was as if he had touched a piece of ice. Moreover, the temperature seemed to be lower than ice. It was a bit cold. He couldn't help but look at his left hand. His face changed slightly. He saw that the skin of his left hand was abnormally pale. This kind of white was different from the whiteness of human skin. It was as white as snow. I can't stay any longer. An alarm sounded in Dean's mind. Suddenly, his heart moved. He turned to look at the unconscious Aisha. His eyes flashed slightly. I can only take a risk. I hope you can hold on. As he spoke, he lifted his backpack and filled it with water again. He sprinkled saltpeter on it and created an ice brick. Then he filled it with water again and created another ice brick. After creating 6 ice bricks in a row, he pieced them together and looked at their length and width. Feeling that they were just right, he immediately sprinkled water on them, allowing the gaps between the ice bricks to freeze and glue together. Soon, an ice bed with a thickness of more than 30 centimeters appeared. Dean put it in the middle of the ice barrier. Then he picked up Aisha's body and put on top of the ice barrier. He let her body lie naturally to ensure the blood circulation of the whole body. Under such a low temperature, I hope it can slow down the spread of the toxins in your body. Dean looked at her deeply. He secretly sighed in his heart. This was also a way to treat a dead horse as a living horse. She might even freeze to death, but there was no other way. He could only hope that her body's super strong physique could resist such cold air. It was not suitable to stay here for a long time. Dean didn't want to accompany her here. The ice blood in his body was ready to move. If he stayed here for a long time, he would freeze to death. When he was about to turn around, he suddenly saw Aisha's mouth wiggling slightly. It seemed that she was talking. He immediately squatted in front of the ice bed and said, "What did you say?" The corner of Aisha's mouth twitched slightly as she uttered a weak voice. Dean put his ear close to her lips. He faintly heard 2 words, "Mom." He looked up at her. He understood that her consciousness was still in a coma. She was just unconsciously murmuring. Dean sighed and shook his head slightly. He got up and walked to the pool next to him. He was ready to jump in and leave. Suddenly, his body stiffened. He looked straight ahead. He saw a 7-meter-long heat source rushing toward him from thousands of meters away. From the way it moved, it seemed to be on a parade. It was an underwater monster. Chapter 558. No, its speed is too fast. Dean could not help but take 2 steps back and stop the idea of diving away. If he went into the water at this moment, he estimated that he would be intercepted by the underwater monster before he could swim to the square pool. With his current physical strength, he might not be able to kill this monster even if he was on the shore, let alone in the water where it was good at. Damn it! Looking at the underwater monster that rushed to about 500 meters in the blink of an eye, Dean's face turned ugly. No longer hesitating, he grabbed a few pieces of saltpeter next to him, used his unconscious and tireless left hand to crush them into powder, and threw them into the water in front of him. Because it was powder, the saltpeter sank relatively slowly. The heat absorption property quickly took effect, and the water gradually turned white, emitting cold air, and the surface of the water slowly condensed into ice. Dean took 2 steps back, closely staring at the underwater monster that swam more than 200 meters away, praying that its perception ability was average and would not be aware of them on the shore. Otherwise, with the size of this monster, it only needed to hit the place where they were hiding a few times to break the ground under them, causing them to fall into the water. The collapsed stones above them would also collapse, submerging them into the water. This underwater monster swam along the smell of blood. Its huge body was like a giant crocodile, but also like a great white shark, but there was not only a fin protruding from its back, but dozens of spikes along the spine, extremely hideous. At this moment, it was like a fish with its 4 limbs folded, its body swaying forward in the water, not causing too much movement. It seemed to be very good at using the power of the water. Dean retreated to the innermost part of the ice barrier, squatting down so that his head was parallel to the frozen water in case the monster peeped at him from under the water. Soon, the monster swam more than 10 meters away, turning its body in the water, gently pushing its tail, Its body swept across the distance of 10 meters, coming to the bottom of the frozen water. Dean held his breath, his whole body tensed up. The next moment, the monster swept under the ice, its hideous figure floating like a shadow under the ice, swimming straight to the distance, seemingly not aware of the two people above the ice. Dean was a little relieved, turning his head to stare at it, only to see that it did not seem to find the source of the smell of blood, gradually swimming away along the flow of the water, disappearing from his sight. That was close. Dean exhaled and came to the frozen water. When he was about to raise his hand to break the ice, he saw a red heat source again. It was the underwater monster that had left earlier. It actually came back from the place where it disappeared. Dean's face slightly changed. He immediately stopped and took a few steps back. He shrank his body into the innermost part of the ice barrier and squatted on the ground. He felt the cold air drilling into his body from all directions. It was so cold that his whole body shivered. He watched as the underwater monster slowly swam over. It skimmed over the ice and swam into the distance, but it did not disappear. Instead, it swam around in the nearby sewers as if it was looking for something. Dean shivered slightly, and at the same time, his eyes followed the monster like a shadow. After a moment, he suddenly felt like he had a cold and runny nose. He subconsciously took a breath, but inhaled the cold air deep into his lungs, stinging his chest. His body slightly arched, his toes could not help but clamp the ground, and his whole body curled up into a ball, but it was still cold and stinging like a knife. I can't wait any longer. It won't leave for a while. Dean slowly raised his eyes, looking at the ice barrier above his head. He could only break the ice barrier and get out from above. He was ready to get up, but suddenly felt that his hands and feet were somewhat unable to stretch. He could not help but take a look, only to find that there was a thin layer of ice on his left hand. There were strange wavy lines like fingernail-sized scales. It's acting up again. He slightly gritted his teeth, passed his thoughts to his left hand, and let it support the ground. Unconsciously, his left hand gently moved. Every time it moved an inch, there was a cracking sound, and at the same time, bursts of tearing pain came from his left hand. Dean's mind was already a little chaotic. Feeling the sharp pain, his first reaction was to look at his right hand, and then he realized that there was no pain in his right hand. Only then did he realize that the pain came from his left hand, which made him a little confused. Didn't his left hand lose feeling? How could there be a feeling of pain now? Did the pain nerves in his left hand recover at this moment? He tried to move his left hand again, and this time the pain was more clear. Every inch of movement had a feeling of breaking, let alone using his hand to support himself. He gave up using his left hand and continued to use his right hand to support the ground. His right hand was a little stiff, but he quickly responded by supporting himself on the ground. He used the force to climb up and stood tremblingly. Suddenly, he felt a burst of dizziness in his mind, like a person with anemia after squatting for a long time. Some shadows flashed in front of his eyes, and his originally wide field of vision was now less than 50 degrees. He could only see things in front of his pupils, and it was a little blurred. "I can't fall down," he repeated in his heart, gasping deeply. He only felt that his brain was buzzing. He lifted his foot and stepped out. His body was a little unbalanced, and he fell on a soft object. He tried to look, but saw Aisha's pale face close at hand. He seemed to be able to smell her breath. She was as tranquil as an ice beauty. His heart was bitter. He turned his head and glanced at the solid ice wall around him. A sad thought emerged in his heart. Is this ice wall cave a tomb that I built with my own hands? The cold spread all over his body, and he couldn't lift the slightest strength. Even his shivering had stopped. He only felt that the cold gradually invaded his body, poured into his heart, spread along his heart to his throat, and even into his brain. This intense chill made him feel as if death was slowly walking into him. When death stands in front of you, what will you think of? At this moment, there was only unwillingness in Dean's mind. He thought of many faces: Hathaway, the monastery's elder of the punishment department, the youth of the Wing family, the vast giant wall, and the lord of the giant wall that he had never seen. At this moment, the figures that made him want to kill appeared in his mind one after another. This made him realize that what he was most reluctant about was not leaving the world, but the people that made him hate. He hadn't killed them all. In addition to these hatred, the ideals that he had planned could no longer be realized. These two mixed together made his heart full of unwillingness. He suddenly remembered that when he had just become a hunter, the first thing he thought of when he encountered a life and death crisis was his parents and sister. But now, he thought more of hatred and unrealized ideals. Chapter 559. It felt like 1,000 years, but also felt like a blink of an eye. In the darkness of the abyss, Aisha walked forward aimlessly. There was no thought in her mind. She was like a walking corpse, until a burning sensation burned her whole body. She felt a burning pain. Her mind was numb. Suddenly, a bit of consciousness appeared in her numb mind. In the silent darkness of the ice cave, Aisha's eyelashes trembled slightly. She slowly woke up. She gently opened her eyes and saw the darkness. Her consciousness followed the source of the burning pain. She subconsciously raised her hand to touch her abdomen. She was very familiar with this burning feeling. It was hunger. The acid in her stomach seemed to be tumbling, stirring the stomach wall violently. At the same time, her body felt like it was being swallowed by her abdomen. She felt that if she continued, her stomach would digest all the internal organs in her abdomen. She struggled to support herself. Suddenly, her palm touched a cluster of cold and sharp things. She couldn't help but turn her head to look. Suddenly, her pupils shrank. She saw a black-haired figure lying on the ice block in her hand. It was the previous dean. At this moment, the latter's body was shrouded with a cold air. There was a faint layer of thin ice on his armor. The place she touched before was Dean's hair. The soft black hair had long been frozen as hard as steel needles. "I'm not dead." Aisha was startled, and the memory before the coma instantly flooded into her brain. Her face changed slightly, and she hurriedly reached out to support Dean. As soon as she touched him, her fingertips instinctively retracted, as if she was bitten by a poisonous snake. There was a kind of tingling feeling which surprised her a little. Even ice cubes couldn't make her feel so cold. Could it be that Dean's body temperature was lower than ice? Although she didn't have any education, years of fighting in various environments made her understand that if the water temperature was lower than ice, it would freeze. That was to say, the blood in Dean's body had frozen. If the blood was frozen, could a person still live? Thinking of this, her face was a little pale. She hurriedly reached out to touch Dean's carotid artery. This was the place that could best reflect the state of suspended animation. However, Dean's carotid artery did not beat. Dead? Her hands trembled slightly as she stared at the youth in a daze. Very quickly, the cold air that invaded her caused her to return to her senses. She couldn't help but raise her head to look around and was immediately stunned. This place was actually a seal barrier made of ice. She was surprised and even a bit at a loss. In her mind, even the coldest day of the black snow season wouldn't condense so much ice. Black snow couldn't be kneaded into ice. Only the monastery's cultivators could borrow the power of nature to fight with ice, fire, wind, and thunder. The shape of the ice barrier had strong traces of manual production. It was obvious that it was built by Dean. Could it be that he was a monk from a monastery? She stared blankly for a while. Suddenly, she saw a 7 to 8 meter long heat source in the darkness in front of her. It looked like it was swimming in the air. Her gaze immediately fell on the frozen water in front of her. In an instant, she immediately understood what had happened before she fainted. She also knew why there was a seal barrier made of ice here. All of this was to prevent the smell of her blood from spreading. She turned her head to look at the frozen Dean next to her. Her expression was a bit complicated, and she slightly clenched her fingers. Crack! Suddenly, there was a cracking sound in the silence. Aisha was shocked. Her first reaction was to look at the frozen water, but soon she saw that there was no monster attacking under the water. At this time, the cracking sound rang again. She suddenly turned back and looked at the source of the sound, Dean's left shoulder. She was slightly startled and quickly pulled off the shoulder pad on Dean's left shoulder. Suddenly, her pupils shrank and her eyes revealed a bit of horror. Dean's left hand was completely frozen. Unlike the transparent ice, it was pure white. In this snow-white arm, she could see blue lines, which were the meridians and blood vessels in Dean's arm. The cracking sound came from Dean's arm. The cold condensed and slowly grew into ice-like spikes, which were caused by the spikes poking into the shoulder pad. Ice freezing disease. Aisha took a light breath. She was a little shocked. She didn't expect Dean to suffer from this terrible and incurable disease. Moreover, it was a legendary taboo disease. With freezing disease, he is more sensitive to temperature changes. He is most afraid of cold. For ordinary people, the temperature drops by 1 or 2 degrees, but for him, it is as cold as dropping by 20 degrees. Aisha's lips trembled slightly, and a trace of mist gushed out of her eyes. She slightly covered her mouth, and there was an impulse to cry. She could resist the temperature inside the barrier made of ice, but for Dean, even if his physique was doubled, he still couldn't resist it. Nevertheless, the boy still chose this most disadvantageous method to fight for a glimmer of life for her. Why? Why did you try so hard to save me? Aisha's eyes were a little wet, and she only felt a pain in her chest. Another person who was close to her was implicated by her. Even if there was no mischief in the middle, the ending was still like this. Why? She clenched her legs and clenched her teeth. After a long, long time, the sadness in her heart gradually faded, and then she thought of the injuries on her body. The corners of her mouth twitched slightly, and she suddenly felt a trace of fatigue and sadness. No matter how great the sadness was, it seemed that it would eventually pass, be forgotten, or be endured, then continue to live. The torn wounds healed day after day in endurance, until they were forgotten. This seemed to be the innate talent of life. Tenacious, cruel. She silently reached out and touched her back. She felt that the wound was cold, and it seemed to have healed. She looked at the ice bed beneath her and suddenly understood. In this low temperature, the poison in her body had permeated more slowly. During this slow permeation, her body's immune system had gradually adapted and improved while resisting for a long time. That was why she had been able to wake up. The role of this ice barrier was not simply to block the smell of her blood, but to inhibit the spread of the toxin in her body. It could be said to be killing 2 birds with 1 stone. However, it was not easy to think of such a method. Even if he thought of it, it may not be implemented in such a desolate world outside the giant wall. She didn't need to think to know that Dean must have painstakingly spent a lot of energy to do this. Chapter 560. Aisha felt sour in her heart. She stretched out her hand and pressed Dean's legs and hands straight, keeping him in a lying position. She decided to keep this ice cave. After her injury was completely healed, she would come back here and bring Dean's body back to the wall to be buried. Looking at the thin frost covering Dean's body, she knew that it would not melt in a short time. This could also keep Dean's body frozen and avoid decay. She took a deep look at him, from his eyebrows to his nose, to his lips, and then to his body. She wanted to remember this boy. From childhood to adulthood, except for the servants, he was the first person who was willing to die for her. When she saw Dean's chest, she was slightly startled. Her eyes that were blurred by the fog could not help but narrow a little. The world in her sight instantly became colorful. Her eyes penetrated into Dean's chest armor and suddenly saw a red heat source, slightly expanding and beating. It was his heart. She was stunned. Not dead. He was not dead. Aisha's eyes widened slightly, and the size of her pupils suddenly returned. She saw that the frost armor on Dean's chest was gently beating in an extremely weak range, and the white frost mist on the armor was also slightly fluctuating. This clear scene made her startled. The next moment, She felt that the blood in her body was boiling, and a huge surprise and excitement gushed out. She quickly squatted beside Dean and pressed her hand on his chest. Suddenly, she felt the surging beat, extremely powerful. This was not the heartbeat of a dying person, but more like a strong heartbeat after a strenuous exercise. The beating was so large that the armor on his body was undulating. She was a little surprised. Previously, Dean was lying on his stomach, so she didn't notice it. What she didn't expect was that the carotid artery was not beating, but the heart was still beating so strongly. This was simply against her common sense. However, since the heart was beating, it could prove that Dean was still alive. She immediately picked up Dean's body and put him on the ground next to her. The frozen disease was most afraid of cold. Previously, she thought that Dean was dead, so she put his body on the ice for storage. Naturally, she could not let him continue to lie on the ice. Otherwise, he would be completely frozen to death, even if he did not die. After Dean was lying on the ground, she pushed the ice bed to the other side, as far away as possible. Then she rubbed her hands to let her palms heat up as soon as possible. After the palms were hot, she immediately reached out and pressed on Dean's heart, letting his heart drive the blood flow of the whole body to restore his body temperature as soon as possible. Her warm palms were pressed against Dean's chest, but it didn't take long for them to feel cold. She immediately lifted her palms, continued to knead, and then pressed them against his chest again. After several hours of continuous movements, her physical strength was finally exhausted, and the wound on her back was also a little painful. Only then did she remember that she woke up because she was hungry, which meant that she had been in a coma for a period of time, maybe a few days. After all, the food in her stomach would not be so easily starved to this extent. Her eyes swept around and suddenly saw a pile of things on the ground. There was a white crystal stone. She recognized it as saltpeter. Next to it were some high-temperature compressed food ingredients. She immediately opened 2 bags and stuffed them into her mouth. While chewing and swallowing, she rubbed her hands together and returned to Dean. She rubbed her palms together and continued to press them on his body. Under continuous efforts, the frost on Dean's chest had subsided. Her hands touched Dean's forehead and cheeks. The head was the most critical place besides the heart. Dean would wake up only when the temperature of the head was restored. Her white hands rubbed back and forth on Dean's cheeks. Unlike his beating heart, the temperature on Dean's cheeks was extremely low. It was cold to the touch, far colder than ice. Although ice was already the coldest thing in her concept. Under continuous rubbing, the frost on Dean's face was removed, but his skin was still hard and extremely cold. From time to time, she raised her hands to breathe, trying to raise the temperature of her palms. But as soon as her palms touched Dean's face, her palms instantly became cold as if they had turned into a block of ice. She suddenly thought of a way to melt the ice. Undoubtedly, the way to melt the ice was to heat it up, but if she could not heat it up, watering it with water would also melt the ice quickly. At least the effect would be better than her current rubbing. She could not help but look back at the frozen water. With her thermal vision, she suddenly saw a 7 or 8 meter long heat source swimming not far away. It should be an underwater monster. Once the ice is broken, it will be alarmed. I have to find a way to kill it first. Aisha's eyes flickered slightly. In her current state, it would be a little difficult to kill this monster underwater, but it was not impossible. What worried her was that once she went into the water, the wound would be infected by the water. If the wound was torn again and blood flowed out, she did not know what other monsters would be attracted. At that time, it would be even more difficult to deal with. Her eyes turned, and suddenly she thought of something. Her eyes brightened. She opened her waist bag and took out a small bottle. She poured out a dark red pill, put it in her mouth, chewed it gently, and spat it out after chewing it. She gently opened Dean's mouth, poured the broken pill in her palm into Dean's mouth, and then stroked his throat to help him swallow it. After a while, she opened Dean's mouth again, only to see that the pill was still in his mouth and it was frozen together. She was startled and a little distressed. If Dean could not swallow the pill, her method could not be implemented. Seeing the frost slowly seeping out of Dean's face, she knew that she could not continue to delay. She took out another bottle from her waist bag. This was a bottle of poison powder. The pill that Dean had taken before was a special antidote for this poison. She was going to sprinkle the poison powder into the water and soak Dean in it. In this way, the monster would be afraid of the poison powder and would not dare to approach. But at present, this method obviously would not work. She picked up the dagger on the ground and came to the frozen water. She gently cut a hole with the dagger, opened the bottle, and sprinkled the poison powder. The underwater monster heard the sound of the ice being cut and immediately swam over quickly. In the blink of an eye, it appeared 50 meters away. At this time, the poison powder fell into the water and immediately drifted away with the surge of the water. The underwater monster did not feel anything and still swam quickly. Seeing this, Aisha held the dagger and lurked next to the ice. Whoosh! The underwater monster came under the ice in the blink of an eye, and its ferocious body swept under the ice. It suddenly turned around in the water, turned back, and raised its head to hit the ice. A cold light flashed in Aisha's eyes. She fearlessly raised the dagger and stabbed at the head of the monster that hit the ice. Puff! The dagger instantly penetrated the monster's head. The ice was broken at the same time. Aisha did not care about affecting the injury. Her arm suddenly exerted force, and the dagger quickly pulled out and then quickly stabbed again. In less than half a second, she stabbed 3 times in a row, each time to a different position, forming a triangular wound. When the last knife stabbed, she shook her wrist and suddenly pried it up. With a click, the flesh in the middle of the triangular wound suddenly flew up. Roar! The hideous mouth of the underwater monster issued a painful roar, and its body suddenly twisted, wanting to shrink back into the water. Aisha's arm suddenly straightened, and the dagger slashed from bottom to top. With the strength of the body of the underwater monster that shrank down, blood instantly bloomed and splashed on the broken ice. The monster shrank back into the water, splashing a meter-high wave on the surface of the water. A lot of blood quickly gushed out from the water, dyeing the water red. After a while, the head of the underwater monster emerged from the water again, soaking in the bright red water. The cuticle on the top of its head was incomparably dark, like a piece of withered bark. Chapter 561. Aisha raised her foot and gently stepped on its head, pushing it forward so that its body would not stop here and attract other monsters. After dealing with the monster, she turned back to the ice cave and looked at Dean, who was frozen on the ground. She was in a dilemma. Although she had killed the monster, there was poison powder in the water, and she had to take an antidote pill to enter the water. The reason why she could kill the underwater monster so easily was that the poison powder had penetrated into its wounds and poisoned it. She paced back and forth. Suddenly, she had an idea. She went to the edge of the water and washed the dagger. Then, she took an antidote and went to the ice bed next to her. She used the dagger to cut off a few thin pieces of ice. She put it in her mouth, and soon the ice melted into water. She continued to hold it in her mouth. When the ice water turned warm, she came to Dean and opened his mouth. She spat the warm water into her hand and sent it into Dean's mouth. Immediately, the frozen fragments of the pill in his mouth were contained and quickly melted. She pushed Dean's jaw to keep opening and closing to relieve his stiff muscles. Soon, the water carried some of the broken pills into Dean's throat. Seeing that it was effective, she immediately stuffed another piece of ice in her mouth. The ice melted quickly, but she felt that her mouth was numb from the cold. After a while, when the ice melted, she continued to spit it into her palm and sent it into Dean's mouth. They repeated the process, like 2 fish trapped on the shore, helping each other. More than 10 minutes later, Dean finally swallowed most of the pills in his mouth under the continuous supply of warm water from Aisha. Seeing that it was almost time, Aisha raised her hand to pick up Dean's body and walked to the water. She was so tired that her head was full of hot sweat. In this cold environment, the sweat quickly cooled down and stuck to her forehead. The cold invaded her body, and she felt dizzy. Gritting her teeth, she put Dean's body smoothly into the water. At this moment, the color of the melted blood in the water was a lot lighter. The body of the underwater monster was also pushed by the current and floated dozens of meters away. When Dean's body entered the water, the frost on the surface of his body quickly subsided. The water in the drainage channel was insulated by the soil, so it was warm to the touch. Although it was an illusion caused by the difference in air temperature, the water temperature was about 10 degrees. At this moment, Dean's body was wrapped in the water, and the water near his body quickly cooled down. Aisha squatted by the water, holding Dean's head with both hands and lifting his chin to prevent the dirty blood from flowing into his mouth. She gently swung Dean with the strength of the current, making the water ripple. The warm water repeatedly washed Dean's body in the ripples. This soaking lasted for half an hour. Through her hands holding Dean's head, Aisha could feel that the coldness of his body was gradually decreasing, and his body temperature was gradually recovering. In her thermal vision, she could also see the heat source emitted from Dean's body. Although it was weak, it was gradually becoming stronger. When she felt that the temperature of Dean's neck and arms were no longer cold, she dragged his body out of the sewage and back into the ice cave. This simple action was effortless for her in the past. But at this moment, she was so tired that she was panting. Although she had eaten a little food before, her physical strength still hadn't recovered. She sat beside Dean's body, physically and mentally exhausted. She had an impulse to lie down and sleep, but she resisted. After a few heavy breaths, she peeled off Dean's upper body armor, pulled out his underwear, wrung it dry, and then wiped his hair, cheeks, chest, and other parts of his body to prevent these water stains from freezing again under the guidance of the frozen disease in his body. After wiping the water stains on his upper body, her eyes suddenly fell on Dean's lower body. There was a flash of hesitation in her eyes, but she finally quickly untied Dean's combat pants and completely stripped them. She used Dean's vest as a towel and wiped all the water stains on his lower body. Then she wrung the vest again and wiped his armor, combat pants, and combat boots, squeezing out all the water stains that could be squeezed out. At this time, Dean's body was once again covered with a faint white frost, and the remaining water stains in his pores gradually froze. Aisha's face changed as she saw this, and she hurriedly used the vest to wipe again. In the process of wiping, she suddenly felt that Dean's body temperature was gradually dropping, becoming colder and colder. No, the temperature here is too low. There's nothing to keep me warm. Her eyes swept around, and the only thing she could find was some food and first aid supplies on the ground. There were no combustible things on the ground, including a fire sickle. She had dark vision and had always been alone, so she naturally didn't need a fire sickle. But at this moment, she was a little regretful. If there was a fire sickle, she could still ignite her combat boots and socks to keep warm. She looked at the unconscious Dean, and her eyes flashed a trace of complex color. After hesitating for a while, she bit her lips slightly, and a touch of faint red suddenly appeared on her pale cheeks. She raised her hand to untie her armor and took off her combat boots. Her snow-white skin was a kind of shocking beauty in this darkness. She raised her hand to hold Dean's shoulder, feeling like she was holding a piece of ice. A biting cold feeling came from her chest. She slightly gritted her teeth and hugged Dean's body tightly. Her toes touched the ground, and her body gently rubbed against Dean's body. In the darkness, she didn't know the sun was rising and the moon was falling. Aisha didn't know how long had passed, but she suddenly heard a slight sound in her ears. She opened her eyes and saw the things in the surrounding darkness. She was startled for a moment, and then realized that she had unknowingly fallen asleep. Feeling the softness and coldness under her body, she immediately looked down and saw that Dean was still lying flat under her. At this moment, his lips were slightly moving, as if he was slightly whispering. There was a flash of joy in her heart. After so long of hard work, Dean finally regained consciousness. Dean's face was pale, his eyes were closed, his brows were wrinkled, and his lips were whispering softly. His expression was a little painful, but also a little ferocious. She slightly leaned over and put her ear close to his lips to listen. When she heard his whisper, she was stunned for a moment. She slowly raised her head and stared at the boy, her eyes flashing slightly. She gently raised her hand to hold his cheek, and her fingers gently rubbed. "It will pass," she whispered, as if saying it to Dean, but also to herself. Chapter 562. Dean felt that he had had a long dream, but the moment he woke up, he couldn't remember the dream at all. A bone-chilling cold hit him. He subconsciously curled up his body and hugged each other, trying to shrink into a ball. "Are you awake?" A soft voice sounded, as if it came from the past. Dean was startled. This familiar voice gave him a feeling that he hadn't felt for a long time. It was like being awakened by his mother when he was a child. He couldn't help but open his eyes. What greeted his eyes was not the warm bed and sunny windowsill in his memory, but a burst of darkness. He slightly blinked his eyes to adapt to the darkness, and soon saw the ring-shaped ice cave behind the darkness. He suddenly sobered up. "Are you feeling better?" A soft voice came from his side. Dean turned his eyes and saw Aisha sitting on the side staring at him. There was a trace of softness in her eyes, not like her cold appearance in the past. Dean didn't think much about the change in her attitude. He was pleasantly surprised. "Are you awake? Your poison has been detoxified?" Seeing the eagerness and joy on his face, Aisha's mouth revealed a trace of a smile. "My poison has been temporarily stabilized. It's you who had fainted here. Fortunately, you have finally woken up." Dean was startled for a moment, and then he felt his whole body was cold. He looked down and saw that the armor on his body was somewhat disheveled. Cold wind poured into the collar and cuffs. He immediately straightened the armor, but there was a trace of doubt in his heart. He was very clear about his armor, but now it seemed that his armor had been moved. He couldn't help but look up at Aisha. Aisha noticed Dean's strange look, and her heart jumped. Her cheeks quickly turned light red. She turned her head and said as if nothing had happened, "I checked your wound and took off your upper body armor. You have the frozen disease, but you dare to live in this ice sculpture fortress. Do you want to be buried with me?" She deliberately changed the topic and glanced at Dean. Dean smiled slightly and said, "I also want to go, but there is a monster waiting for me outside. He suddenly found that there was no monster outside in his sight. Moreover, the frozen water in front of him had disappeared, revealing the swaying water inside. The color of the water was a trace of turbid and scarlet, and there was a faint smell of blood. He couldn't help but turn a look at Aisha. "Did you kill that monster?" Aisha responded with a soft hum. Dean was a little stunned and said with a wry smile, "Sure enough, a skinny camel is still bigger than a horse." "I'm not a camel," Aisha corrected. Dean looked at her and suddenly remembered her previous words. He turned around and looked at his body. His face slightly changed. "How long was I in a coma?" "I don't know. You were in a coma when I woke up." Aisha estimated. "It should be a few days." "A few days?" Dean was stunned. He was suffering from ice blood disease. In such an environment, let alone a few days, even if he stayed for a few hours, he would freeze to death. He glanced at his left hand and suddenly froze. The skin color of his left hand was the same as before, as white as snow. The whole arm up to the shoulder was a snow-white color. In addition, there were dark blue spikes on the arm, extending along the back of the arm to the shoulder. These spikes didn't look like frozen ice, but some kind of hardened cuticle. Aisha noticed Dean's gaze and sighed in her heart. "You suffer from ice disease. When I woke up, you were already frozen. After you recovered, your arm was already like this. If I'm not wrong, your arm has completely frozen. In the future, you'd better not touch cold things, or the ice disease will spread to your whole body. At that time, you will no longer have human thinking, but become another you, no different from a zombie." Dean's body was shocked. He looked up at her and said, "Frozen disease? Do you mean ice blood disease?" Aisha nodded slightly. Ice blood disease is also called ice disease. People who suffer from this symptom will gradually freeze until they completely become an iceman. No, it should be an ice demon. Is there a way to cure this? Dean looked at her as if he was grasping at a straw. Aisha bit her lips slightly. This is an incurable disease. Even our dragon family has no way to cure it. The only way to alleviate the outbreak of ice disease is to live in a high-temperature environment for a long time, such as soaking in a hot spring or in a room with a stove and fireplace. The higher the surrounding temperature, the better. Dean's face was ugly. The dragon family had a long history. Even they had no way to cure it. It was most likely that it was really difficult to cure. However, the current medical technology couldn't cure it, but it didn't mean that it wouldn't work in the future. He believed that after he developed medical technology, he would find a way to cure it and unveil the true face of God's blessing. Since you are awake, leave here immediately. Aisha looked at Dean's pale face and said, "This place is too unfavorable for you. If you continue to stay, your ice disease will break out again." Dean nodded slightly. He also had the same intention. Suddenly, he thought of something. When Aisha woke up, he was frozen. Then in such a cold environment, how did his body temperature recover? He glanced at Aisha. He wanted to say something, but hesitated. Finally, he held back and said, "Then I'll go first. You stay here and recuperate. I'll go out and find something to eat for you." "No need. Just take care of yourself. I can hold on," Haisha said. Dean didn't say anything more. He dived into the water, opened his wings, and swam toward the square pool. Soon, he swam along the drainage channel to the square pool. He jumped out of the water and flew to a low altitude of more than 10 meters. Suddenly, he saw a huge shadow floating on the surface of the pool. It looked exactly like the previous underwater monster. At the moment, the body of the underwater monster was crawling with strange leech-like insects, as well as small demonic pests such as bloodthirsty flies. They occupied the body as a nest. It seemed that no one could escape the fate of being eaten. Dean sighed, turned around, and flew to the square pool. He looked around and saw some red spots moving in the nearby collapsed buildings. They were bone biter rats. You're tuning into the Warrior Lore YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and join us on this journey to catch the most captivating stories.